The fog rolled thick over Hampstead Heath that November evening in 1807, swallowing the gaslight from the distant coaching inn until only a faint yellow smudge remained against the darkness. The mail coach rattled along the northern road, its wheels grinding through mud and fallen leaves, the horses breathing hard plumes of vapour into the cold air. Inside, 3 passengers sat rigid with cold and apprehension, their hands tucked into muffs and greatcoats, saying nothing. The coachman above kept his eyes forward, though he could see barely 10 feet ahead through the mist. He knew this stretch of road. Everyone knew this stretch of road. For 3 months now, travellers had been stopping their coaches, finding their doors open, their valuables gone, and no memory of how it happened. No shots fired, no voices raised, no struggle at all. The authorities called it mass hysteria. The newspapers called it a phantom. The coachman called it the Silent Highwayman, and he gripped his whip tighter as the horses slowed near the old oak where the road forked toward Highgate. The fog pressed close. The wheels creaked. And then, without warning, without sound, the coach simply stopped. The horses stood still as stone. The passengers blinked as though waking from sleep. And when the coachman climbed down to investigate, he found the strong box open, the mail satchel sliced clean through, and not a single soul anywhere in sight. The fog curled around him like a living thing. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled midnight, and the Silent Highwayman, once again, had vanished into the Victorian night. Chapter 1. The Fog and the Fear. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, and the world outside has grown still. Wherever you are listening from, whatever hour finds you in this moment, I invite you to let the day fall away. Perhaps you are in bed, the lamp dimmed low. Perhaps you sit in a chair as the house settles around you. Tell me, if you would, where does this story find you tonight? What time shows up on your clock? And if you have not yet done so, I ask you to subscribe to this channel so that we might continue these journeys together into history's darker hours. Now let us drift backward through time, through the decades and the centuries, until we arrive in a London very different from the one that stands today, yet familiar in its shadows. The year is 1867, and autumn has come to the greatest city on earth. The fog arrived early that year. It came in the first week of September, rolling up from the Thames in thick grey banks that smothered the streets and turned the gaslight into useless smudges of yellow against the darkness. London had always known fog. The city bred it from the river and the coal smoke, from the exhalations of 2.5 million souls living pressed together in brick and stone. But the fog of that autumn seemed different somehow. It lingered longer. It pressed closer. It filled the lungs with a damp heaviness that made breathing feel like drowning in slow motion. The newspapers remarked upon it. The Times published editorials about the miasma and its effects upon the health of the populace. Physicians warned of respiratory ailments, and in the coaching inns along the northern roads, travellers began to speak in low voices about something else the fog had brought with it. The first incident occurred on the 7th of September, though it would not be reported in the papers until 3 days later, and then only as a minor curiosity buried on the inner pages. A private coach travelling from Barnet to London had been found at dawn on Hampstead Heath, its horses standing perfectly still in their traces, their breath steaming in the cold morning air. The coachman sat slumped on his box, unconscious. Inside, 2 passengers, a merchant named Thomas Ridley and his wife Catherine, were discovered in a similar state of stupor. When they were finally roused by a passing mail carrier, none of the 3 could properly account for what had happened. They remembered the journey beginning normally. They remembered the fog growing thicker as they climbed toward the heath. They remembered the sound of the wheels and the horses, and the night pressing close around them. And then they remembered nothing at all until they woke to find themselves stopped on the roadside, the strong box beneath the coach seat forced open and empty. Mrs. Ridley's jewellery case rifled through, and the merchant's wallet taken from his coat pocket while he sat wearing it. The local constabulary took statements. The victims were examined by a physician who could find no signs of violence, no marks of struggle, no evidence of any drug or poison in their systems. The coachman swore he had seen no one approach. The passengers insisted they had heard no sound of forced entry. The horses showed no signs of having been frightened or restrained. It was as though the coach had simply stopped of its own accord in the middle of the lonely heath, and some invisible presence had gone through it at leisure while its occupants slept. The constables wrote it down in their ledgers as a peculiar robbery, likely the work of some cunning thief who had found a way to stupefy his victims without their knowledge. They advised travellers to be cautious on the northern roads after dark. They sent a report to Scotland Yard, and they thought very little more about it. But the fog did not lift. Through the second week of September it continued to roll across London every evening, turning the city into a maze of shadows and muffled sounds. The gaslights fought against it and lost. The omnibuses crawled through the streets at walking pace. The great railway termini became cathedrals of steam and smoke where trains arrived late and passengers disembarked confused and coughing. In the wealthy squares of Belgravia and Mayfair, servants went about with lanterns in the middle of the afternoon. In the slums of Whitechapel and Shoreditch, the fog mixed with the smoke from 10,000 chimneys and became a thick yellow soup that stained clothing and turned the air itself into something solid and choking. And on the roads that led north from the city toward Highgate and Hampstead, toward Barnet and Finchley, the fog settled deepest of all. On the 14th of September, another coach was found stopped on the Archway Road. This time there were 4 passengers, all respectable tradesmen, returning from business in the northern suburbs. All 4 described the same experience. The journey had been proceeding normally, despite the fog. They had been conversing, discussing the day's affairs, complaining about the weather. The coach had been climbing the long hill toward Highgate when suddenly everything became unclear. One of the men, a draper named William Heston, said it felt as though he had been falling asleep without meaning to, as though something heavy had settled over his thoughts and pulled him down into darkness. Another passenger, a solicitor called James Frith, said he remembered seeing a figure standing in the road ahead, tall and dark against the fog, but when he tried to call out a warning to the coachman, his voice would not come. And then they all woke together, the coach at a standstill, the coachman staring blankly ahead, and their pockets empty of watches and coin. This time the newspapers took notice. The Morning Post ran a small article titled "Mysterious Robberies Boil on Northern Roads." The Daily Telegraph published a letter from a reader who suggested the fog itself might contain some noxious vapour that induced sleep. A physician writing to the Lancet proposed that the victims had all suffered simultaneous fits of catalepsy brought on by the unusual atmospheric conditions. But among the coaching trade and the innkeepers and the travellers themselves, a different theory began to circulate. They spoke of a highwayman, but not the kind from the old stories. This was no gentleman of the road with pistols and bold declarations. This was something else, something that moved through the fog like a part of it. Something that could stop a coach without a sound and rob its passengers while they sat helpless and unseeing. Some began to call him the Phantom, others called him the Ghost of Hampstead Heath. But the name that took hold, the name that would be whispered in coaching inns and circulated in penny dreadfuls, was simpler and somehow more terrible: the Silent Highwayman. By the end of September, 5 more robberies had occurred. Each followed the same pattern. Each took place after dark on one of the northern roads. Each involved fog so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet. Each left the victims confused and robbed, unable to provide any useful description of their attacker, beyond vague impressions of a tall figure in dark clothing, who seemed to materialize from the mist itself. The coachman could offer nothing more. Some swore they had seen movement in the fog just before losing consciousness. Others insisted they had heard footsteps that seemed to come from all directions at once. One claimed he had caught a glimpse of a face, pale and strange, but when pressed for details he could only shake his head and say it had been like looking at a reflection in troubled water. The Metropolitan Police, still a relatively new institution, found itself confronted with a type of crime that seemed to belong more to Gothic romance than to the modern age of railways and telegraphs. The commissioners received anxious letters from members of Parliament whose constituents travelled the northern roads. The coaching companies demanded protection for their routes. The newspapers began to publish increasingly sensational accounts, each one adding new details to the legend. One article claimed the Silent Highwayman could walk through solid matter. Another suggested he used some Eastern art of mesmerism to control the minds of his victims. A third proposed that he was not one man but several, part of an organised gang using new scientific methods to commit the perfect crime. In the taverns and coffeehouses, Londoners debated the mystery with the same fervour they brought to discussions of the Empire and the Irish question. Some scoffed at the entire affair, insisting it was mass delusion brought on by the fog and the darkness and the human tendency towards superstition. Others pointed to the consistent nature of the reports and argued that something genuinely unusual was occurring on the northern roads. The educated classes consulted their encyclopedias and scientific journals. Looking for rational explanations, the working classes consulted fortune-tellers and spiritualists, looking for supernatural ones. And on the roads themselves, after the sun went down and the fog began to roll in from the river, travellers grew nervous and coachmen drove faster, eager to reach the safety of the next inn before the Silent Highwayman could strike again. October came, and with it a cold that seemed to sink into the bones of the city. The fog grew worse, if such a thing were possible. There were mornings when it did not lift at all, when London existed in a perpetual twilight of grey and yellow, when the sounds of the city became muffled and distant, and the whole metropolis felt like a place half drowned beneath an invisible sea. The churches rang their bells, and the sound barely carried 100 yards. The street sellers called their wares, and their voices died in the thick air. And on the northern roads, the Silent Highwayman continued his strange work. 3 more robberies occurred in the first 2 weeks of October, then 4 more before the month's end. The pattern never varied, the method never changed. Always the fog, always the northern roads, always the same inexplicable loss of consciousness and awareness. By now, the total number of victims had reached nearly 30. The amount of property stolen was considerable, thousands of pounds in jewellery and cash and valuables. But what troubled the authorities more than the theft was the manner of it. This was not the work of common criminals. This was something organised, intelligent, and utterly unprecedented. The Silent Highwayman, whoever or whatever he might be, had found a way to commit robbery with almost complete impunity, leaving behind no evidence, no witnesses who could provide useful testimony, and no clue as to his identity or whereabouts. The fear that had begun as mere caution now settled over the northern roads like the fog itself. Travellers began to avoid the routes entirely after dark, choosing instead to stay overnight in the suburbs, rather than risk the journey back to London. The coaching companies saw their evening traffic decline sharply. The innkeepers along the Highgate and Hampstead roads found their common rooms crowded with nervous passengers who preferred to wait for morning rather than venture into the mist. And in the offices of Scotland Yard, senior officers gathered around maps of the northern districts, plotting the locations of the robberies and trying to discern some pattern that might help them predict where the Silent Highwayman would strike next. But the fog kept its secrets. The Silent Highwayman moved through it like a creature born of it, striking when and where he pleased, vanishing without trace, leaving behind only confusion and empty pockets and the growing legend of a phantom thief who could not be caught because he could not truly be seen. Victorian London, that great engine of empire and industry, that monument to progress and rational thought, found itself haunted by something it could not explain. And as October drew toward its close and November's cold began to settle over the city, the question on everyone's mind was simple and terrible. Who was the Silent Highwayman, and how could he be stopped? Chapter 2. The City of Smoke and Gaslight. London in the autumn of 1867 stood at the apex of empire, a sprawling metropolis that stretched for miles in every direction from the ancient heart of the city, swallowing villages and fields and turning them into streets and squares and endless rows of brick houses that marched toward every horizon. It was the largest city the world had ever known, home to more souls than had lived in ancient Rome at its height, a place of such density and complexity that it seemed less a single city than a nation unto itself, complete with its own tribes and territories and unwritten laws. From the grand terraces of the West End to the fetid rookeries of the East, from the financial palaces of Threadneedle Street to the dockside warrens of Wapping, London contained within itself every human condition, every vice and virtue, every dream and nightmare that civilization could produce. The Thames cut through it like a dark artery, carrying commerce and filth in equal measure. The great bridges spanned the water at intervals, their stone arches crowded day and night with traffic, both pedestrian and wheeled. On the river itself, steamships and sailing barges and wherries moved in constant procession, their crews shouting across the water in a dozen languages, for London drew people from every corner of the earth. The docks received goods from India and China, from Africa and the Americas, from Australia and the Caribbean. Tea and spices and silk came up these gangplanks alongside timber and coal and grain. The warehouses along the waterfront stood 5 and 6 stories tall, their brick walls blackened by decades of smoke, their interiors filled with the wealth of empire waiting to be distributed across the nation. But if the river was London's artery, then the railways were its nervous system, those iron lines that radiated from the great termini like spokes from a hub. Paddington and Euston, King's Cross and St Pancras, Victoria and Waterloo, each one a cathedral of the industrial age, their vaulted roofs of iron and glass soaring above platforms where trains arrived and departed with mechanical precision. The locomotives brought passengers from every county in England, from Scotland and Wales, from the ports where ships docked with travellers from the continent. They brought mail and newspapers and manufactured goods. They brought fresh food from the countryside to feed the millions who lived in streets that had never seen a field or a farm. The railways had transformed London in a single generation, making it possible for the city to grow beyond any previous limit, making it possible for a clerk to live in Clapham and work in the city, for a merchant to conduct business in Manchester in the morning and be home in Kensington by evening. Above ground, the streets themselves formed a labyrinth that could bewilder even those born to it. The great thoroughfares like Oxford Street and Piccadilly carried rivers of humanity from dawn to midnight. A constant flow of omnibuses and hansom cabs, of carriages and carts, pedestrians dodging between the wheels and hooves. The crossing sweepers stood at every corner, boys mostly, clearing paths through the muck of horse dung and mud for ladies and gentlemen willing to spare a penny. The street sellers called their wares in voices that had to carry over the din of iron wheels on cobblestone, over the shouts of cabmen and the bells of the omnibuses. Hot chestnuts and fresh milk, flowers and ribbons, matches and bootlaces, everything that could be sold was sold on the streets of London, hawked by men and women and children who lived by their ability to make themselves heard above the urban roar. The gaslight had come to most of London by 1867, transforming the nights from the dangerous darkness of earlier decades into something merely dim and shadowy. The lamplighters made their rounds at dusk, moving from post to post with their long poles, bringing each lamp to flickering life until the streets glowed with a wan yellow illumination that pushed back the night just far enough to make movement possible. In the wealthy districts, the gaslights stood close together, creating pools of relative brightness. In the poorer areas, they were spaced farther apart, leaving long stretches of darkness between them where anything might transpire unseen. The light was never strong enough to truly banish the shadows, only to define them more sharply, to create a world of contrasts where everything existed in either the glow of the lamps or the blackness beyond their reach. Beneath this surface world, London harboured another city entirely. The sewers and tunnels formed a subterranean mirror of the streets above, a dark network of brick passages and vaulted chambers where the waste of millions flowed toward the Thames through Joseph Bazalgette's new intercepting sewers, that marvel of engineering that had finally ended the Great Stink and made life in London bearable during the summer months. The toshers descended into this underworld to scavenge what they could from the filth, wading through refuse in search of coins and jewellery and anything else of value that might have been washed down from above. They knew passages that connected to forgotten cellars, to ancient crypts, to spaces that predated the modern city by centuries. London was built upon itself, layer after layer of history pressed down into the earth, Roman walls and medieval foundations and Tudor cellars all jumbled together beneath the Victorian streets. The population itself was as stratified as the geology. At the top stood the aristocracy and the wealthy merchants living in their squares and terraces, where servants answered doors and coal fires burned in every room. They moved through London in private carriages, insulated from the masses by upholstery and glass. They dined in clubs where the membership was measured in generations. They attended Parliament and the Opera and the Royal Academy exhibitions. Their London was one of drawing rooms and ballrooms, of carefully maintained social distinctions and inherited privilege. Below them came the vast middle classes, that great creation of the Victorian age. The clerks and shopkeepers and professionals who aspired to respectability and achieved it through steady employment and careful management of appearances. They lived in modest houses or respectable lodgings, they attended church regularly, they read improving books and sent their sons to grammar schools in hopes of advancement. And beneath the middle classes, forming the broad base of London's human pyramid, came the working poor, that vast multitude who laboured in factories and workshops, who loaded ships and drove carts, who cleaned houses and tended shops, who did all the physical work that kept the city functioning. They lived in tenements and courts, in rooms that housed entire families, in buildings where water had to be carried from a single pump in the yard and sanitation meant a shared privy that served dozens. They worked from before dawn until after dark for wages that barely sustained life. Their children went to work as soon as they could be useful, at 7 or 8 years old, spending their days in factories or on the streets rather than in schools. Disease moved through their neighbourhoods like a constant tide, taking the weak and the very young, leaving survival to those with the strongest constitutions and the best luck. Into this vast human hive, the Metropolitan Police had been introduced less than 40 years earlier, a radical innovation that replaced the old system of parish constables and night watchmen with a centralised professional force. The men in their blue uniforms and tall helmets had gradually become a familiar presence on London streets, though their authority was still sometimes contested and their methods still developing. They walked their beats in all weather, alone usually, responsible for maintaining order in districts that could turn violent without warning. They were armed with nothing but truncheons and whistles, expected to control situations through presence and force of personality rather than weapons. Some were former soldiers, accustomed to discipline and danger. Others came from the working classes themselves, drawn by the promise of steady wages and a uniform that commanded a certain respect. Scotland Yard, the headquarters of the Metropolitan Police, stood on the Thames Embankment, a building that had become synonymous with detective work and criminal investigation. Here the senior officers maintained their offices. Here the files accumulated on every significant crime in the metropolis. Here the detectives gathered information and formulated theories and sent constables out across the city in pursuit of malefactors. The detective branch was still relatively small, comprised of men who had shown aptitude for investigation, who could think beyond the immediate and obvious, who understood that solving crime required patience and method rather than merely responding to it with force. They dealt with murders and forgeries, with frauds and thefts, with all the clever criminality that flourished in a city too large for anyone to know all its corners. The courts administered justice with efficiency, if not always with mercy. The Old Bailey saw a constant procession of prisoners, their cases heard and judged with remarkable speed. Conviction rates were high, sentences were severe. Transportation to Australia had recently ended, but prison sentences were long and hard labour was the norm. The gallows still stood at Newgate for the worst offenders, though public hangings had been abolished only recently, moved behind prison walls where the spectacle could no longer draw the massive crowds that had once treated executions as entertainment. The threat of punishment was meant to serve as deterrent, but crime continued regardless. for poverty and desperation and simple human venality were constants that no amount of policing could fully suppress. Yet despite its criminals and its poverty, despite its fog and its filth and its vast inequalities, London possessed an energy that was unmistakable and intoxicating. It was a city perpetually in motion, building and tearing down and building again, expanding its boundaries year by year, absorbing everything around it and transforming it into itself. The new buildings going up in every district spoke of confidence and permanence, their facades decorated with columns and pediments, or their interiors fitted with the latest conveniences. The British Museum displayed treasures from around the world. The new Albert Memorial rose in Kensington, a Gothic monument to the Prince Consort and to Victorian ambition. The Crystal Palace stood in Sydenham, that vast greenhouse of iron and glass where the Empire's achievements were put on permanent display. This was the London that existed when the Silent Highwayman began his work in the autumn of 1867. A city of progress and poverty, a gaslight and shadow, a confidence shaken occasionally by reminders that not everything could be explained or controlled by science and industry and the Metropolitan Police. The northern roads where the robberies occurred were not distant from the city's heart, but they formed a kind of boundary zone, places where the urban gave way gradually to the rural, where the dense streets thinned out into scattered villas and market gardens, where the fog rolled in thickest and the gaslight stopped and the darkness of the countryside began. These were transitional spaces, neither fully civilized nor truly wild, and it was here that something had found room to operate beyond the reach of London's authority. The coaching trade still flourished on these routes despite the rise of the railways. Many people preferred the coaches for shorter distances, valuing the flexibility of stopping at any inn, or the ability to bring more luggage than the railways allowed. The coaches ran on regular schedules, their routes and times published in the newspapers and posted at the coaching offices. The coachmen were skilled men who knew every turn and gradient of their roads, who could drive in darkness and weather that would stop less experienced hands. But they had never encountered anything like the Silent Highwayman. The old highwaymen of the previous century had been dangerous but comprehensible, men with pistols who could be fought or fled from. This new terror defied understanding. It struck without warning and disappeared without trace. It turned the familiar roads into places of dread. And so London in that autumn existed in a peculiar state of tension. On one hand, it was the greatest city of the greatest empire the world had known, a place of unparalleled wealth and power where the future was being built with steam and steel. On the other hand, it was still a place where the fog could hide mysteries that reason could not penetrate, where the darkness beyond the gaslight held possibilities that made even the most educated men uneasy. The Silent Highwayman represented something that did not fit the Victorian narrative of progress and control. He was an anachronism and an impossibility, yet he was undeniably real, taking tangible property from solid citizens who could not explain how he did it. And as the robberies continued through October and the authorities found themselves no closer to stopping them, the question began to arise whether London's much-vaunted civilization was as comprehensive as its citizens liked to believe, or whether there were still spaces in and around the metropolis where older, stranger things could operate beyond the reach of law and lamplight. Chapter 3. The First Silence. The merchant Thomas Ridley would remember the 7th of September 1867 for the rest of his life, though the memory would always be incomplete, full of gaps and uncertainties that troubled him more than the loss of his property. He was a practical man by nature and profession, a dealer in textiles who had built a successful business through careful attention to detail and a sceptical disposition toward anything that could not be measured or accounted for in ledgers. He did not believe in ghosts. He did not credit tales of supernatural intervention in human affairs. He attended church regularly, but considered religion primarily a matter of moral guidance rather than miraculous intervention. Yet what happened to him on that September evening shook his certainties and left him with questions he could never satisfactorily answer. The day had been unremarkable. He had travelled to Barnet on business, visiting a small manufactory that produced cotton goods he intended to purchase for resale in London. His wife Catherine had accompanied him, as she sometimes did when the weather was pleasant and the journey not too long. They had concluded their business by late afternoon, taken tea at a respectable inn, and engaged a private coach for the return journey to their home in Bloomsbury. The coachman was a man named William Parsons, known to the innkeeper as reliable and experienced on the northern roads. The horses were sound. The coach itself was well maintained. Everything about the arrangement spoke of safety and normalcy. They departed Barnet as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, the autumn light turning golden and then amber as they made their way south. Catherine sat beside Thomas, her travelling cloak wrapped close against the cooling air, her reticule on her lap containing the small jewellery she wore when travelling. Nothing of exceptional value but pieces she favoured. Thomas carried in his inner coat pocket his wallet, with approximately £40 in banknotes, the proceeds from a recent sale that he intended to deposit at his bank the following morning. Beneath their seat, locked in a small strong box to which Thomas held the only key, was an additional sum in gold sovereigns, nearly £100 that he was bringing back from the Barnet transaction. It represented a significant amount of money, but Thomas felt secure. Robbery on the northern roads was not unknown, but it generally took the form of bold confrontations, highwaymen with pistols who stopped coaches in dramatic fashion. Against such threats, travelling during the daylight hours and hiring a reliable coachman seemed adequate protection. The fog began to appear as they descended from the higher ground around Barnet toward the heath. At first it was merely a haziness in the low-lying areas, a thickening of the air that softened the outlines of distant trees. But as they continued south it grew denser, rising from the ground like something exhaled by the earth itself. Thomas remarked upon it to Catherine, noting that they might be delayed if it grew much worse. She nodded, but did not seem concerned. They had travelled through fog before. London bred it constantly. It was an inconvenience, but nothing more. By the time they reached Hampstead Heath, the fog had become genuinely thick. Thomas could see it pressing against the coach windows, turning the outside world into an indistinct grey blur. The gaslight from the distant buildings appeared as faint yellow smudges that gave no real illumination. The coachman above called down to ask if they wished to stop and wait for the fog to thin, but Thomas, eager to reach home, told him to continue carefully. The horses slowed to a walk. The wheels creaked over the rough road surface. Inside the coach, Thomas and Catherine sat in silence, listening to the muffled sounds of the journey, the jingle of harness and the steady clop of hooves on packed earth. Thomas would later try many times to recall exactly what happened next, but his memory would never be clear. He remembered looking at Catherine, seeing her face pale in the dim light inside the coach. He remembered the sound of the wheels changing slightly as they moved from a harder surface to softer ground. He remembered thinking that they must be crossing one of the more isolated stretches of the heath, where the road ran between stands of old trees and open grassland. And then he remembered a peculiar sensation, as though the air inside the coach had become heavier somehow, pressing down on his chest and making each breath an effort. He tried to speak to Catherine, but found that forming words required concentration that he could not quite manage. His thoughts seemed to slow and blur like objects seen through water. He remembered seeing movement outside the coach window, or thinking he saw movement, a darker shape against the grey fog that might have been a man, or might have been merely a thickening of the mist itself. He tried to lean forward to see more clearly, but his body would not respond properly. His limbs felt distant from him, as though they belonged to someone else. He heard Catherine make a small sound, a sort of confused murmur, and when he turned his head with what seemed like enormous effort, he saw that her eyes were closing, her head tilting forward as though she were falling asleep sitting upright. He tried to reach for her, but his hand barely moved. The last thing he remembered clearly was a sense of the coach stopping, though he could not recall feeling the usual jolt and sway of it coming to rest. It simply stopped moving, and in that stillness Thomas felt himself falling away from consciousness, sliding down into darkness that was warm and soft and completely irresistible. He had a final impression of the door beside him opening, of cold air flowing into the coach, of someone or something moving past him with a sound like cloth brushing cloth. And then there was nothing at all until he woke to find himself still sitting in the coach with Catherine slumped beside him and a stranger's face peering in at them through the open door. The stranger was a mail carrier who'd been riding north toward Barnet when he came upon the coach standing motionless on the roadside. The horses were in their traces, their heads down, breathing steadily as though resting. The coachman sat on his box in an attitude of complete stillness, his hands loose on the reins, his eyes open but unseeing. The mail carrier had called out several times before climbing down from his own horse and approaching cautiously. When he received no response, he had opened the coach door to find the two passengers inside in a similar state of unnatural sleep or stupor. It took several minutes to rouse them. The mail carrier shook Thomas by the shoulder, called his name repeatedly, and finally succeeded in bringing him back to something like consciousness. Thomas blinked and stared around in confusion. His head ached. His mouth was dry. He felt as though he had been asleep for hours, though it could not have been more than 20 minutes since they had entered the thickest part of the fog. Catherine woke more slowly, stirring and murmuring before finally opening her eyes and looking around with an expression of complete bewilderment. Above them, the coachman came to himself gradually, shaking his head and asking in a thick voice what had happened. It was Catherine Nand who first noticed that her reticule had been opened. She had held it closed on her lap, she was certain of that, but now it lay beside her with its clasp undone and her jewellery gone. Thomas immediately checked his coat pocket and found his wallet missing. He fumbled beneath the seat for the strongbox and discovered it had been forced open, the lock broken, the gold sovereigns vanished. The three of them stared at the evidence of the theft in stunned silence. The mail carrier insisted they must have been robbed, but none of them could explain how. The coachman swore he had seen no one approach. Thomas had no memory of anyone entering the coach. Yet their valuables were indisputably gone, taken while they sat unconscious or stupefied by some means they could not comprehend. The mail carrier helped them drive to the nearest constabulary station, a small building in Highgate where a single constable was on duty. The constable took their statements with obvious scepticism. He examined them for signs of injury or intoxication and found neither. He questioned them closely about what they had eaten and drunk that day, clearly suspecting some kind of poisoning or drugging, but nothing they had consumed had been shared with the coachman, and all three had been affected identically. The constable wrote everything down in his careful hand, assured them that the matter would be investigated, and sent them on their way with the distinct impression that he believed them to be victims of their own carelessness or confusion, rather than any genuine mystery. Thomas Ridley returned home that night deeply unsettled. The loss of the money troubled him, certainly, but what troubled him more was the gap in his memory, the sense that something had happened to him that he could not account for or understand. He was a man who valued explanation and rational order. He ran his business according to principles of cause and effect, of predictable outcomes following from known actions. What had occurred on Hampstead Heath violated those principles. It suggested that there were forces or methods at work that his understanding could not encompass. In the days that followed, he found himself reluctant to speak about the incident except in the most general terms. When friends asked about the robbery, he provided a brief account and changed the subject. At night, lying awake beside Catherine, he found his thoughts returning again and again to those lost minutes, trying to reconstruct what had happened, trying to find some rational explanation for the inexplicable. Had there been an odour in the coach just before he lost consciousness? He thought perhaps there had been, something faint and sweet that he had barely noticed. Had the figure he glimpsed in the fog been real or imagined? He could not say with certainty. The whole experience had a dreamlike quality that made it difficult to separate actual memory from subsequent imagination. Catherine fared even worse. She became nervous about travelling, reluctant to go any distance from home, starting at sudden sounds and checking locks repeatedly. She had lost jewellery that her mother had given her, pieces that could not be replaced. But more than the material loss, she felt violated in some fundamental way, as though something had invaded not merely her possessions but her very consciousness, reaching into her mind and taking control of her will. She began to have nightmares about suffocation, about being held down by invisible weight while shadows moved around her. Thomas called in a physician who examined her and prescribed a tonic for her nerves, but the dreams continued. The coachman William Parsons gave up his position and took work in a stable yard where he would not have to drive at night. He told anyone who would listen that he had driven coaches for 20 years without incident, through every kind of weather and on every sort of road, and he had never experienced anything like what happened that September evening. He insisted that the horses had stopped of their own accord, that he had not pulled on the reins or called out to them. One moment they had been walking steadily through the fog, the next they had simply ceased moving, standing as still as if they had been carved from stone, and he had felt something then, he was certain of it, a presence in the fog around them, something watching and waiting. The memory of it made his hand shake when he spoke of it. The three of them had been the first, though they did not know it at the time. They had encountered something that would trouble the northern roads for months to come, something that moved through the fog with purpose and intelligence, that could render travellers helpless without violence or even visible contact, that could take what it wanted and disappear, leaving no trace but confusion and missing valuables. They had met the Silent Highwayman in his first appearance, before he had a name or a legend, when he was merely an inexplicable event that the authorities would try to dismiss as coincidence or delusion. But Thomas Ridley knew better. In the merchant's practical soul, sceptical of supernatural explanations and trained to deal in tangible realities, a seed of profound unease had been planted. He had encountered something on Hampstead Heath that his reason could not encompass, and the knowledge that such things were possible would haunt him long after the monetary loss had been absorbed and forgotten. The fog had given up one of its secrets that night, and having seen it once, however imperfectly, Thomas Ridley would never again view the world with quite the same certainty he had possessed before. Chapter 4. The Phantom's Pattern. Through the final weeks of September and into October, the robberies continued with a regularity that suggested method and deliberation rather than opportunistic crime. The pattern was so consistent that it began to seem almost ritualistic, as though the thief were following some private ceremony that required each element to be precisely replicated. The Metropolitan Police, examining the accumulating reports from the northern districts, could not help but notice the similarities. Every incident occurred after dark, every incident took place during heavy fog, every incident left the victims in the same state of confused stupefaction, and every incident resulted in theft of valuables without any clear evidence of how the thief had approached, entered the coach, and departed again without being seen or heard. On the 14th of September, as previously noted, 4 tradesmen were robbed on the Archway Road. On the 19th, a private carriage carrying a solicitor and his clerk was found stopped near Finchley, with both men unconscious and their cash boxes empty. On the 23rd, a mail coach travelling to Barnet was discovered abandoned on Hampstead Heath. His driver slumped over the reins, the mail sacks rifled through and several registered parcels missing. On the 28th, 2 separate coaches were hit on the same evening, one near Highgate and one on the Edgware Road, both following the identical pattern. By the end of September, the total number of confirmed robberies had reached 10, with victims numbering nearly 25 people if passengers and coachmen were counted together. The descriptions provided by the victims were frustratingly vague and contradictory. Some claimed to have seen a tall figure in dark clothing moving through the fog. Others insisted they had seen nothing at all before losing consciousness. A few mentioned a pale face glimpsed briefly, but they could not agree on its features. One woman swore the robber had been wearing a long coat that reached to his ankles. A merchant claimed the figure had been wrapped in a cloak that made him blend with the mist. A coachman testified that he had heard footsteps approaching, but they had seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, as though several people were surrounding the coach, though only one thief had apparently been involved, given that the robberies followed the same pattern when they occurred separately on different roads. What united all the accounts was the experience of sudden, overwhelming drowsiness that preceded the actual theft. Victims described it in various ways, but the essence was always the same. One moment they were alert and aware, The next they felt as though they were falling asleep, standing or sitting, unable to resist the heavy pull downward into unconsciousness. Some remembered trying to fight it, attempting to call out or move, but finding their bodies would not obey. Others reported that the onset was so swift they had no time to react at all. The sleep or stupor lasted no more than 15 or 20 minutes in most cases, but during that time the thief worked with apparent leisure, going through pockets and bags and strong boxes, taking money and jewellery and anything else of value, and departing without leaving any physical evidence of his presence. The medical men consulted by the police were divided in their opinions. Some suggested the victims had been exposed to some form of soporific gas or vapour, perhaps chloroform or ether, administered in a concentration sufficient to induce unconsciousness, but not strong enough to cause lasting harm. This theory had the appeal of scientific plausibility. Chloroform had been in medical use for 20 years as an anaesthetic, and ether even longer. Both substances were known to cause rapid loss of consciousness when inhaled. But the theory also presented significant practical problems. How could the thief administer such substances to victims inside a moving or stopped coach without being seen? How could he expose both passengers and coachmen simultaneously when they were separated by the coach body and walls? And why did none of the victims report smelling the characteristic sweet odour of chloroform before losing consciousness? Other physicians proposed that the phenomenon might be explained by some form of mass hysteria or suggestion, particularly given that many of the later victims had heard stories of the earlier robberies and might have been predisposed to experience similar symptoms. But this explanation satisfied no one, least of all the victims themselves, who insisted they had been genuinely unconscious and had woken with headaches and dry mouths consistent with having been drugged. Moreover, the theft of tangible property proved that something real had occurred, not merely a shared delusion. The strong boxes had been forced open, the wallets had been taken, the jewellery was gone. Whatever had rendered the victims helpless was effective enough to allow the thief ample time to search through their belongings methodically. A few voices, primarily in the more sensational newspapers and among those inclined towards spiritualist beliefs, suggested that the Silent Highwayman might not be operating through purely physical means at all. Perhaps he possessed some faculty of mesmerism or animal magnetism that allowed him to exert control over the minds of his victims from a distance. Perhaps he was in league with supernatural forces that granted him powers beyond normal human capability. These suggestions were dismissed by educated opinion as superstitious nonsense, yet they reflected a genuine unease about the seemingly impossible nature of the crimes. How could one man working alone apparently stop coaches and rob passengers with such consistent success while leaving no clues and creating no opportunities for capture? The fog itself became a subject of speculation. Several observers noted that the robberies only occurred during the periods of unusually thick mist, never on clear nights or even during ordinary London fog. This suggested the thief was using the fog as cover, certainly, but some wondered if there might be more to it than simple concealment. Could the particular atmospheric conditions that produce such dense fog also create pockets of bad air that affected consciousness? Were there natural emanations from the heath itself, some miasma rising from the ground that the thief had learned to recognise and exploit? These theories merged science and folklore in ways that revealed how unsettled even rational minds had become when confronted with crimes that defied explanation. What made the situation more troubling for the authorities was the thief's apparent knowledge of his targets. He struck only at coaches that were carrying something worth stealing. The mail coaches he robbed always contained registered parcels of value. The private coaches he stopped were always conveying passengers of means who travelled with money or jewellery. This suggested reconnaissance, some method of identifying profitable targets in advance. Yet inquiries among the coaching offices and inns produced no useful information. No one reported seeing anyone suspicious asking questions about passengers or schedules. No coachman recalled being followed or observed in the days before being robbed. The Silent Highwayman seemed to select his victims with preternatural accuracy without any visible means of gathering intelligence. The geographical patterns was equally puzzling. All the robberies occurred within a rough circle, perhaps 5 miles in radius, centred on Hampstead Heath. The thief apparently knew the northern roads intimately, understood which stretches were most isolated, where the fog tended to gather thickest, where a stopped coach might sit for 20 minutes without being discovered by passers-by. This local knowledge suggested someone familiar with the area, possibly someone who lived in or near one of the villages that dotted the northern suburbs. The police made inquiries in Hampstead and Highgate, in Finchley and Barnet, asking about strangers or residents behaving suspiciously. They found nothing. The communities were small enough that newcomers would be noticed, yet no one reported anyone unusual taking up residence or spending time observing the roads. As October progressed and the robberies continued, a kind of grim fascination settled over London. The newspapers published breathless accounts of each new incident, often embellishing the facts with dramatic language about phantom thieves and impossible crimes. The penny dreadfuls, those cheaply printed booklets sold on street corners, began to feature lurid stories about the Silent Highwayman, giving him various fantastical origins and abilities. In some versions, he was a disgraced aristocrat taking revenge on the society that had rejected him. In others, he was a mesmerist from the Orient using mysterious Eastern powers. One particularly popular story claimed he was the ghost of a highwayman executed at Tyburn a century earlier, condemned to haunt the northern roads until some ancient wrong was avenged. The coaching trade suffered considerably. Traffic on the northern routes declined sharply as travellers chose to avoid them entirely, or to travel only during daylight hours when the fog was less likely to be thick. The coaching companies complained to the authorities that they were losing business and might have to curtail service if the situation continued. The innkeepers along the roads reported similar losses. The residents of the northern suburbs began to feel isolated, cut off from easy access to London by the fear that had settled over what should have been ordinary thoroughfares. A sense of siege developed, a feeling that the city's normal order and security did not extend fully into these boundary zones where urban gave way to rural. The Metropolitan Police increased patrols in the affected areas, sending constables to walk the roads at night and positioning men at intervals along the most frequently targeted stretches. But the northern roads covered many miles, branching into numerous smaller lanes and paths, and the force did not have enough men to watch every possible route. Moreover, the fog that enabled the thief to operate also hampered the police. Constables walking their beats could see no more than a few feet ahead. Communication was difficult when visibility dropped to arm's length. The Silent Highwayman, whoever he was, had chosen his method and his environment with care. He was operating in conditions that negated most of the advantages the police might otherwise have possessed. By the third week of October, a certain desperation had entered the official response. The Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police faced questions in Parliament. The newspapers began to criticise the force's inability to stop a single robber, who had now committed more than 15 successful thefts. Editorial writers suggested that perhaps the old system of parish constables and private thief-takers might have been more effective. Letters appeared in the Times and the Daily Telegraph offering various theories and solutions, most of them impractical or based on misunderstandings of the actual circumstances. One correspondent suggested using bloodhounds to track the thief. Another proposed that passengers should be armed with pistols. A third recommended that all coaches travel in convoys with armed guards riding alongside. The victims themselves formed an unlikely community, united by their shared experience of inexplicable violation. Several of them corresponded with each other, comparing notes, trying to find some detail that might have been overlooked in the official investigations. Thomas Ridley, the merchant from the first robbery, organised a meeting at his home where a dozen victims gathered to discuss what they remembered. They talked late into the night, going over every particular of their experiences, but emerged with no new insights. What they did develop was a shared conviction that they had encountered something genuinely unusual, something that could not be dismissed as ordinary crime dressed up in sensational narrative. They had been rendered helpless by means they could not identify. They had been robbed by someone who moved through fog like a creature born to it. And they had all, without exception, felt in those moments before losing consciousness a sense of presence, of being observed and assessed by an intelligence that was calculating and utterly confident. The autumn deepened. The days grew shorter and the nights longer. The fog continued to roll in from the Thames every evening, sometimes lifting by morning but often persisting through entire days, turning London into a city of shadows and muffled sounds. And on the northern roads, coaches continued to be stopped, their passengers and drivers rendered unconscious, their valuables taken by a thief who left no trace and seemed capable of striking whenever and wherever he chose within his chosen territory. The Silent Highwayman had established a pattern that was both predictable in its elements and utterly unpredictable in its specific timing and location. He had become a phantom that haunted the fog-bound roads, a presence that could not be caught because it could not truly be confronted. And as October moved toward November, as the total number of robberies approached 20, the question that obsessed the police and the public alike remained unanswered. Who was he and how could he possibly be stopped? Chapter 5. Scotland Yard takes notice. The summons arrived at Detective Inspector Edmund Blackwell's desk on the morning of October the 24th, 1867, delivered by a messenger who waited for no reply before departing back down the corridors of Scotland Yard. The note was brief, written in the precise hand of Chief Superintendent Richard Mayne, requesting Blackwell's presence in the Commissioner's office at 2 o'clock that afternoon to discuss a matter of some urgency regarding the Northern District robberies. Blackwell read the message twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in his coat pocket. He had been expecting this summons for nearly a week, ever since the newspapers had begun their relentless criticism of the Metropolitan Police's failure to apprehend the so-called Silent Highwayman. It was the sort of case that attracted attention precisely because it defied easy solution, and Blackwell had learned over his 15 years with the detective branch that such cases eventually found their way to his desk. Edmund Blackwell was 43 years old that autumn, a tall man with greying hair and a face that had settled into lines of permanent thoughtfulness. He had joined the Metropolitan Police as a young constable in 1852, walking beats in Whitechapel and Shoreditch, where he learned the rhythms of criminal life in London's poorest districts. He possessed a quality that his superiors had recognised early, a capacity for patient observation combined with an analytical mind that could see patterns where others saw only disconnected incidents. He had been promoted to the detective branch after solving a series of warehouse thefts that had baffled investigators for months, tracking the stolen goods through a network of receivers until he had assembled evidence sufficient to secure convictions against an entire criminal organisation. Since then, he had built a reputation for handling the cases that required methodical investigation rather than immediate action. The crimes that could not be solved by witnesses or confessions, but only by careful accumulation of facts and rigorous logical deduction. He arrived at the Commissioner's office precisely at 2 o'clock and was shown in immediately. Chief Superintendent Mayne sat behind his desk, a man in his 60s with white hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Standing by the window was Superintendent James Henderson of the Northern District, a younger man whose normally confident demeanour had been considerably diminished by the past month's events. Both men looked up as Blackwell entered, and Mayne gestured toward a chair. The conversation that followed was direct and unadorned with pleasantries. Mayne explained that the robberies on the northern roads had become a matter of political concern as well as criminal. Members of Parliament were asking questions, the newspapers were suggesting incompetence, the coaching companies were threatening to seek private protection for their routes if the Metropolitan Police could not provide security. Most troubling was the sense that the crimes were making the police appear powerless, unable to prevent or solve a series of robberies that had now reached 23 incidents with nearly 50 victims. The situation required resolution, and Mayne had decided to assign it to someone with a demonstrated capacity for solving difficult cases. Blackwell listened without interruption, his hands folded and in his lap, his expression neutral. When Mayne finished, Blackwell asked a single question. Did he have authority to conduct the investigation as he saw fit, without interference from district superintendents or pressure to produce rapid results that might compromise thoroughness. Mayne glanced at Henderson, who nodded reluctantly, and then assured Blackwell that he would have full authority and whatever resources he required. The only constraint was time. If the robberies continued through November without progress toward apprehending the thief, there would be consequences for everyone involved, including Blackwell himself. The detective accepted the assignment with the same calm demeanour he brought to all his work. He requested copies of every report filed regarding the robberies, interviews with all available victims, and permission to examine any physical evidence that had been collected. He also asked for 2 constables to be assigned to assist him, men with experience in the northern districts who knew the roads and the local population. Mayne agreed to everything and dismissed him with the understanding that Blackwell would provide weekly reports on his progress. As Blackwell left the office, Henderson caught up with him in the corridor and spoke in a low voice about the peculiar nature of the crimes, about how his men had found nothing despite weeks of investigation, about how the whole business had an uncanny quality that made ordinary police work seem inadequate. Blackwell thanked him for the warning, but offered no opinion. He preferred to form his own judgments based on evidence rather than the impressions of others. He spent the remainder of that day and all of the next reading through the accumulated reports. The files filled a wooden crate that was delivered to his office, containing statements from victims, observations from constables who had investigated the scenes, medical opinions, and various theories that had been submitted by members of the public. Blackwell read every document carefully, making notes in his meticulous handwriting, organising the information into categories. By the evening of the second day, he had compiled a detailed chronology of the robberies, noting the dates, times, locations, weather conditions, and specific circumstances of each incident. He also created lists of common elements and anomalies, looking for patterns that might reveal something about the thief's methods or identity. Several things became apparent from this analysis. First, the robberies were confined to a specific geographical area and occurred only under specific conditions. The thief required heavy fog and darkness, suggesting he was using these for concealment. Second, the thief had intimate knowledge of the northern roads, knowing which stretches were most isolated and where he could work without interruption. Third, the thief was selective about his targets, suggesting reconnaissance or inside information about which coaches carried valuables. Fourth, the method of rendering victims unconscious was consistent across all incidents, pointing to a specific technique or substance rather than improvisation. And fifth, despite the number of incidents and victims, not a single piece of concrete physical evidence had been recovered. No footprints, no torn fabric, no dropped items, nothing that might provide a clue to the thief's identity. This last point troubled Blackwell more than anything else. In his experience, criminals always left traces. They might be small, easily overlooked, but they existed. A thread caught on a nail, a distinctive boot print in mud, a smell lingering in a room. The complete absence of such evidence suggested either remarkable care on the part of the thief or some aspect of the crimes that the investigators had not properly understood. Blackwell made a note to examine the coaches themselves, if any were still available, and to speak with victims personally rather than relying solely on written statements. On the morning of October the 27th, he began conducting interviews. He had sent messages to a dozen victims, requesting meetings at times convenient to them. Most agreed readily, eager to help, and perhaps hoping that a detective of Blackwell's reputation might finally make progress where others had failed. He spoke with them individually, usually in their homes or places of business, and he asked the same questions of each. What exactly did they remember, in as much detail as possible, about the moments before losing consciousness? Had they noticed any unusual smells or sensations? Had they seen anything, however briefly, that might identify the thief? Did they recall any sounds that seemed out of place? The answers reinforced what the written reports had already indicated, but Blackwell was interested in nuances that did not always appear in official statements. Several victims mentioned a sweet smell, faint but distinct, just before losing consciousness. When pressed, they described it variously as like flowers, like fruit, like medicine. One woman, the wife of a banker, said it reminded her of the in the room when her mother had been given chloroform during a surgical procedure years earlier. This struck Blackwell as significant. Chloroform was a possibility he had already considered based on the medical opinions in the files, but direct testimony linking the smell to the substance was valuable confirmation. He also paid attention to the descriptions of the figure seen in the fog. While the details varied, certain elements recurred. The thief was tall, perhaps 6 feet or slightly more. He wore dark clothing, possibly a long coat or cloak. He moved quietly, without the heavy footfalls that would be expected from a man of such size, and several victims mentioned that he seemed to appear suddenly, as though materializing from the fog itself, rather than approaching from a distance. Blackwell suspected this last detail was more perception than reality, a trick of limited visibility combined with the disorienting effects of the drugging, but he noted it nonetheless. What struck him most forcefully in these interviews was the emotional state of the victims. These were not people given to hysteria or wild imagination. They were merchants and solicitors, tradesmen and their wives, coachmen who had driven the roads for years. They were practical people describing an experience that had shaken their sense of reality. Several admitted they had trouble sleeping since the robbery. Others said they avoided travelling after dark. One coachman had given up his profession entirely. Blackwell recognised that whatever had happened to these people had affected them profoundly, not merely in terms of property loss, but in terms of their fundamental sense of security and understanding. After completing the initial round of interviews, Blackwell turned his attention to the physical locations where the robberies had occurred. He obtained a detailed map of the northern districts and marked each incident site with a pin. The pattern that emerged was revealing. The robberies clustered around Hampstead Heath but extended along the roads that radiated from it like spokes from a wheel. The farthest incident had occurred about 4 miles from the Heath near Finchley. The closest had been on the Heath itself. This suggested the thief operated from somewhere in or near Hampstead, using the Heath as a central point from which he ranged outward, depending on opportunities and conditions. Blackwell decided to visit the locations himself. On a cold afternoon in late October, accompanied by Constable William Davies, one of the men assigned to assist him, he travelled to Hampstead and spent several hours walking the roads where the robberies had taken place. He examined the terrain, noting which sections offered good visibility and which were enclosed by trees or hedges that would provide cover. He timed how long it took to walk between various points, calculating how far the thief could travel on foot before and after each robbery. He spoke with innkeepers and toll collectors, asking if they had noticed anyone unusual on the roads during the relevant periods. Most had not, though one innkeeper recalled a tall man in a dark coat who had stopped for ale one evening in September. A stranger who had asked casual questions about the coaching schedules and then departed without giving a name. The fog that had plagued London through September and early October had lifted somewhat by the final week of the month, and no new robberies had been reported since October 20th. Blackwell wondered if this was significant. Was the thief waiting for conditions to deteriorate again, or had the increased police presence made him cautious? There was also the possibility that he had accumulated enough stolen property to satisfy himself for a time, or that he intended to let the immediate furor die down before resuming operations. Blackwell made notes on all these possibilities, building a picture of the thief's thinking and methods through inference and deduction. What emerged from this analysis was a profile that surprised none of his colleagues when he shared it with them. The Silent Highwayman was likely a man of above-average intelligence who had planned his crimes carefully. He had knowledge of chemistry or medicine sufficient to use chloroform effectively. He understood the roads and the patterns of travel. He was physically capable of moving quickly and working efficiently under time pressure. He was bold enough to commit multiple robberies despite increasing police attention, yet cautious enough to leave no evidence. And he had some connection to the Hampstead area, either as a resident or someone with regular business there. This profile narrowed the field of suspects somewhat, but not enough to enable immediate action. Hampstead and its surrounding villages contained thousands of residents, and any number of them might fit the general description. Blackwell needed something more specific, some detail that would point to a particular individual rather than a type. He decided his next step should be to investigate the disposal of stolen property. The thief had taken a considerable amount of valuables over the past 2 months, jewellery and cash and other portable items worth several £1,000s in total. Unless he intended to keep everything indefinitely, he would need to convert at least some of it to usable funds, and that meant dealing with receivers, those members of the criminal economy who purchased stolen goods and resold them through legitimate channels. Blackwell knew the major receivers in London from years of investigation. He began making discreet inquiries, sending trusted informants into the network of pawn shops and second-hand dealers, asking if anyone had recently been offered jewellery or other items matching description from the robbery victim. This was delicate work that required patience and careful management of sources. The receivers operated on trust and secrecy, and any hint that police were asking questions would cause them to close ranks. Blackwell worked through intermediaries, offering small payments for information, building gradually towards something useful. While these inquiries proceeded, he continued to study the files and refine his understanding of the crimes. He paid particular attention to the mechanism of the drugging. Chloroform was his leading theory, but administering it effectively in the open air presented challenges. The substance evaporated quickly and required relatively close proximity to be effective. The thief would need to approach the coaches without being seen, introduce the chloroform in sufficient concentration to affect everyone inside and the coachman above, and do so quickly enough that victims had no time to react or escape. This suggested some kind of device or method for dispersing the vapour, something more sophisticated than simply holding a cloth soaked in chloroform. Blackwell consulted with a chemist at Guy's Hospital, explaining the circumstances without revealing the specific case. The chemist confirmed that chloroform could be administered as Blackwell suspected, but noted that it would require significant expertise to do so safely and effectively. Too little, and the victims would not lose consciousness. Too much, and they might die from respiratory failure. The thief was apparently skilled enough to find the correct balance, which suggested either medical training or extensive experimentation. The chemist also mentioned that chloroform was readily available for purchase by anyone claiming medical need, sold by chemists throughout London without particular restrictions. This meant the thief could have obtained supplies easily without arousing suspicion. By early November, Blackwell had assembled a comprehensive understanding of the crimes but remained frustrated by the lack of concrete leads toward identifying the perpetrator. He had dozens of pieces of information, but nothing that connected them into a complete picture pointing to a specific individual. The thief remained a shadow defined by his actions but not by his identity. Blackwell was accustomed to difficult investigations, but there was something uniquely challenging about this case. The thief operated in conditions that rendered normal investigative methods nearly useless. The fog concealed him, the drug silenced witnesses, the lack of physical evidence prevented forensic analysis. It was as though the crimes had been designed specifically to frustrate police work, calculated to exploit every weakness in the Metropolitan Police's capabilities. Yet Blackwell was not discouraged. He had solved cases before when initial prospects seemed poor. Success in detective work came not from brilliant insights, but from methodical accumulation of facts and persistent pursuit of every possible lead, no matter how minor it seemed. The Silent Highwayman had been successful thus far because he had been fortunate and careful, but fortune eventually ran out, and no one could be careful forever. Somewhere in the mass of information Blackwell had gathered, there existed a thread that would lead to the thief's identity. His task was to find that thread and follow it patiently until it brought him to his quarry. And as November began and the fog showed signs of returning to London streets, Blackwell prepared himself for what he suspected would be a continuation of the robberies, and he hoped, an opportunity for the thief to make the mistake that would finally reveal him. Chapter 6. The Witnesses Speak. The drawing room of Thomas Ridley's house in Bloomsbury was warm with fire and lamplight on the November evening when Edmund Blackwell arrived to conduct his interview. A servant showed the detective in and took his coat and hat before withdrawing silently. Ridley rose from his chair by the fire to greet Blackwell, offering his hand and gesturing toward a second chair that had been positioned nearby. The merchant was a man in his middle 40s, well dressed but without ostentation. his face showing the lines of someone accustomed to calculation and careful judgment. His wife Catherine sat in a chair near the window, her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed but wary. Blackwell thanked them both for agreeing to speak with him and settled into the offered seat, withdrawing a small notebook from his coat pocket. He began by explaining that he was reviewing all the cases from the beginning, not because previous investigators had been incompetent, but because fresh examination sometimes revealed details that had been overlooked or not properly understood. He assured them that their time would not be wasted, that every small detail they could provide might prove significant. Ridley nodded and said they would help however they could. Catherine said nothing, but her hands tightened slightly in her lap. Blackwell had learned to read such signs over years of interviewing witnesses. She was afraid of something, though whether it was the memory of the robbery or something else he could not yet determine. He asked Ridley to describe the evening of September 7th in his own words, starting from when they left Barnet. The merchant spoke clearly and methodically, organising his recollection as he might organise a business report. They had departed around 6 o'clock. The weather had been clear initially, but fog had developed as they approached Hampstead. The coach had slowed appropriately. Everything had seemed normal until they reached the most isolated stretch of the heath. Then came the strange sensation he had described in his written statement, the heaviness in the air, the difficulty breathing, the sense of losing control over his own body. He remembered seeing something outside the window, a shape in the fog, but could not say with certainty whether it had been a man or merely his imagination. Blackwell listened without interrupting, occasionally making brief notes. When Ridley finished, he asked about the smell. Had there been any unusual odour just before losing consciousness? Ridley paused, his brow furrowing in concentration. Yes, he said slowly. There might have been something. Sweet, faint, not unpleasant exactly, but noticeable. Like flowers, perhaps, or like medicine. He had not thought much of it at the time, because everything had happened so quickly, but in retrospect he could recall that smell distinctly. It had been in the coach, he was certain of that, though he could not say where it had come from. Catherine spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but firm. She remembered the smell as well. She said it had reminded her of something from her childhood, when a servant in her father's house had been given medicine for pain. The physician had used a cloth soaked in something that had made the woman sleep peacefully. Catherine had been allowed to sit with the servant during the procedure, and she remembered the sweet, heavy odour that had filled the room. The smell in the coach that September evening had been similar, though not as strong. When Blackwell asked if she meant chloroform, she nodded and said yes, that was the word, chloroform. This was valuable confirmation. Blackwell made a careful note and then asked Catherine about what she had seen. Had she noticed the figure her husband mentioned? She hesitated before answering, glancing at Ridley as though seeking permission or support. Then she said that yes, she had seen something, someone, standing very close to the coach window on her side. She had not told her husband this before because it sounded foolish, but the figure had been looking directly at her through the glass. She had seen his face, or thought she had, pale into the dark, with eyes that seemed to catch what little light there was. But the strange thing, the thing that made her doubt her own memory, was that the face had not seemed quite real somehow. It had been like looking at a face under water, distorted and unclear, present but not solid. Blackwell asked her to describe the face in more detail. She struggled to find words. It had been elongated, perhaps, or perhaps that was an effect of the fog and the glass between them. The eyes had been dark, she thought, but she could not be certain. There might have been a beard, or it might have been shadow. The overall impression was of someone tall and thin and very deliberate in his movements. She remembered thinking in the moment before consciousness left her that the figure was studying her, assessing her like a physician might assess a patient. Then everything had gone dark and she had known nothing more until waking to find herself robbed. The memory clearly distressed her. Her hands were trembling slightly and her voice had become unsteady. Blackwell judged it best not to press her further on the visual details. Instead, he asked about the aftermath. How had she felt upon waking? What symptoms had she experienced? Catherine described the headache that had persisted for hours, the dry mouth and throat, the sensation of having been deeply asleep for much longer than the actual time elapsed. She had felt weak for the remainder of that day and into the next, as though recovering from an illness. The physician who examined her had found nothing physically wrong, but had prescribed a tonic that she had taken for several days. Ridley added that the coachman had experienced similar symptoms. The man had complained of headache and nausea for a full day after the robbery. He had also reported strange dreams in the nights that followed, vivid nightmares in which he was being pursued through fog by something he could not see but could hear breathing behind him. The coachman had been so affected that he had given up his position and taken other employment. Ridley had tried to convince him to stay, offering increased wages, but the man had refused. He wanted nothing more to do with coaching on the northern roads. Blackwell asked whether they had noticed anything unusual in the days before the robbery. Had anyone been asking questions about their travel plans? Had they seen anyone watching their house or following them? Ridley thought carefully before shaking his head. Their trip to Barnet had been routine, arranged only a few days in advance. They had told no one outside their household about it except the coaching office, where they had hired the vehicle. As far as he knew, there had been no way for anyone to predict they would be travelling that particular evening. Yet the thief had been waiting, or so it seemed, positioned perfectly to intercept them at the most vulnerable point of their journey. This raised questions that Blackwell had been considering since beginning his investigation. If the thief had not known in advance about specific targets, he must be operating opportunistically, taking advantage of whatever coaches passed through his territory during suitable conditions. But the success rate suggested otherwise. Nearly every coach the thief attacked had been carrying something worth stealing. Random interception would produce some coaches with minimal valuables, but the Silent Highwayman seemed to select only profitable targets. This implied either remarkable luck or some method of identifying which coaches were worth robbing. Blackwell posed this question to Ridley, who admitted he had wondered the same thing. As a businessman, he understood that successful crime required information just as successful commerce did. The thief must have some way of learning which coaches carried valuables, but how he acquired that information remained mysterious. Ridley speculated that someone at the coaching offices might be providing details, or perhaps servants in various households were selling information about their employers' travel plans. But such conspiracies seemed elaborate for what appeared to be the work of one man operating alone. The interview concluded after nearly 2 hours. Blackwell thanked them both and promised to inform them if his investigation produced results. As he was leaving, Catherine called him back and spoke in a voice low enough that her husband, who had walked ahead to request the servant bring Blackwell's coat, could not hear. She told the detective that she had not mentioned something in her written statement because it sounded mad, but she felt compelled to tell him now. When she had been looking at the figure through the coach window just before losing consciousness, she had felt as though something was being taken from her that had nothing to do with jewellery or money. She felt as though the figure had been reaching into her mind somehow, touching something essential. The sensation had been intimate and violating in a way that the theft of property could never be. She wanted Blackwell to know this, even if he thought her hysterical, because she believed it was important. Blackwell assured her he did not think her hysterical, and that he took her observations seriously. He asked if she had experienced anything similar since the robbery, any sense of that intrusive presence. She said no, the feeling had been confined to that moment in the coach, but the memory of it remained vivid and troubling. She sometimes woke at night, feeling as though someone was standing over her bed, watching her, though when she lit a lamp, there was never anyone there. Her husband thought she was suffering from nervous strain brought on by the robbery, and perhaps he was right, but she could not shake the conviction that what had happened to her was more than simple theft. From the Ridleys, Blackwell proceeded to interview other victims over the following days. He spoke with the 4 tradesmen who had been robbed on the Archway Road, meeting them at a tavern in Highgate where they gathered regularly. He interviewed the solicitor James Frith in his chambers, surrounded by legal documents and the smell of old paper. He tracked down several of the coachmen who had been drugged and robbed, finding them in stable yards and coaching offices, men who'd spent their lives on the roads and were now wary of the very routes they had once travelled without fear. Each interview added details to the picture Blackwell was constructing. The solicitor Frith provided the most precise description of the figure he had glimpsed in the fog, describing a man wearing what appeared to be a long coat that reached nearly to the ground, buttoned high at the neck with a hat pulled low over his face. Frith had the impression of someone who had dressed deliberately to avoid recognition, covering as much of himself as possible. He also mentioned that the figure had moved with an unusual grace, almost gliding through the fog rather than walking. This detail appeared in several other accounts as well. This sense that the thief moved differently than ordinary men, with a fluidity that seemed unnatural. One of the coachmen, a man named Albert Simmons, who had driven mail coaches for 20 years, provided technical observations that Blackwell found particularly useful. Simmons explained that the horses had behaved strangely during his robbery. Normally, when a coach stopped suddenly, the horses would react, tossing their heads, stamping, showing some sign of agitation. But in his case, they had simply ceased walking and stood perfectly still, as though they too had fallen under some influence. Simmons had seen horses drugged before for medical treatment or to calm them during transport, and their behaviour that evening had reminded him of animals that had been given sedatives. He wondered if the thief had somehow drugged the horses as well as the human victims, though he could not imagine how such a thing might be accomplished. Another witness, a woman named Margaret Ashford, who had been travelling with her sister when their coach was robbed near Finchley, described hearing a sound just before losing consciousness. It had been a soft hissing, like steam escaping from a valve, lasting only a few seconds. She remembered turning toward the sound, trying to locate its source, and then everything had become confused and she had fallen into blackness. Her sister had heard the same sound but had interpreted it differently, thinking it might have been wind moving through trees. Blackwell noted this carefully. A hissing sound suggested some mechanism for releasing vapour, confirming his theory that the thief used a device to disperse the chloroform. The accumulation of testimony began to reveal certain consistencies that Blackwell found significant. The thief always approached from the left side of the coaches, the side where passengers sat. He worked quickly, no more than 10 to 15 minutes from when victims lost consciousness until they woke. He never spoke, maintaining complete tablets throughout the robbery. He took cash and jewellery but ignored other items even when they had value, suggesting he wanted only things that could be easily carried and quickly converted to money. And he left no physical trace, not even the scent of chloroform lingering after he departed, as though he cleaned up after himself with the same care he exercised during the robbery itself. What Blackwell found most intriguing was the psychological effect on the victims. Nearly all of them described feeling violated in ways that went beyond material loss. Several used similar language to Catherine Ridley, speaking of something essential being taken or touched. They felt exposed, vulnerable, as though the thief had gained access to private spaces within themselves. A merchant named Henry Wallace told Blackwell that he had dreams after the robbery in which he was transparent, made of glass, with the thief looking through him and seeing everything he thought and felt. Wallace was embarrassed to admit this, clearly concerned the detective would think him weak or imaginative, but Blackwell assured him such reactions were common after traumatic experiences. Yet Blackwell wondered if there might be something more to these psychological effects than simple trauma. Chloroform was known to produce strange mental states in some individuals, hallucinations and distortions of perception. Perhaps the concentration used by the thief, carefully calibrated to induce unconsciousness without causing death, also produced these feelings of intrusion and exposure. Or perhaps the victims, rendered helpless and robbed by an unseen presence, were experiencing a rational fear response that manifested as these more abstract anxieties about violation of their inner selves. Either way, the pattern was consistent enough to be noteworthy. By the second week of November, Blackwell had interviewed more than 20 victims and compiled pages of detailed notes. He had descriptions that, while vague, consistently pointed to a tall man in dark clothing who moved with unusual quietness and grace. He had confirmation that chloroform or something very similar was being used. He had testimony about a hissing sound that suggested a dispersal device. He had observations about the horse's strange behaviour and the thief's systematic approach to selecting and removing valuables. What he did not have was any clue to the thief's identity or whereabouts. The man remained a cipher. known only by his effects and his method. Blackwell returned to his office at Scotland Yard and arranged his notes into categories, looking for connections he might have missed. He created timelines and maps, plotting the robberies against coaching schedules and weather patterns. He listed every specific detail mentioned by witnesses, no matter how minor, and looked for anomalies or unique elements that might distinguish this thief from others. The work was painstaking and often tedious, requiring hours of concentration and the willingness to follow threads of reasoning that often led nowhere. But this was the nature of detective work as Blackwell understood it. Success came not from inspiration, but from refusing to overlook any detail, from building the case piece by piece until the accumulated evidence pointed unmistakably toward truth. As he worked, the fog returned to London's streets. November brought cold rain that mixed with the coal smoke and river damp to create banks of yellow-grey mist that settled over the city and refused to lift. The northern roads disappeared into this fog each evening, their gaslights creating useless halos of wan illumination that did nothing to penetrate the murk. And Blackwell knew, with the certainty born of pattern recognition, that the Silent Highwayman would soon return to his work. The conditions that enabled his crimes had returned. The thief would be preparing his chloroform and his dispersal device, watching the roads, selecting targets, and somewhere in the accumulated testimony and evidence, Blackwell needed to find the detail that would allow him to be waiting when the next robbery occurred. Chapter 7. The Theory of Chloroform. On the afternoon of November 13th, Detective Inspector Blackwell sat in the laboratory of Dr. Henry Latherby, Medical Officer of Health for the City of London and Professor of Chemistry at the London Hospital. The laboratory occupied a large room on the hospital's upper floor, its benches covered with glassware and scientific apparatus, its walls lined with shelves holding bottles of chemicals and preserved specimens. The air carried the complex smell of substances both organic and synthetic, a mixture that most visitors found unsettling, but which spoke to Blackwell's rational inquiry and methodical investigation. Dr. Latherby stood at one of the benches, a man in his 50s with sharp eyes behind spectacles, demonstrating the properties of chloroform, while Blackwell watched and took notes. The detective had come seeking expert knowledge about the substance he believed the Silent Highwayman was using. The testimony of victims had provided strong suggestions that chloroform was involved, but Blackwell needed to understand the practical aspects of its use as a criminal tool. How could it be administered effectively in the open air? What equipment would be required? What expertise would the thief need to possess? Dr. Latherby had been recommended as someone uniquely qualified to answer such questions, having written extensively about the medical uses of anaesthetics and served as an expert witness in several cases involving poisoning and chemical substances. The doctor held up a glass bottle containing clear liquid. Chloroform, he explained, was a remarkable substance with a peculiar history. It had been discovered only 20 years earlier in 1847 and quickly adopted for surgical anaesthesia because of its ability to render patients unconscious rapidly and relatively safely when properly administered. Before chloroform, surgeons had relied on ether, which was effective but had certain disadvantages, including a strong odour and tendency to cause nausea. Chloroform overcame these problems while providing deeper and more reliable unconsciousness. Within a few years of its discovery, it had become the preferred anaesthetic in hospitals throughout Britain and Europe. Dr. Latherby removed the stopper from the bottle and allowed Blackwell to smell the contents from a safe distance. The detective detected a sweet odour, pleasant but with an underlying sharpness, exactly as victims had described. The doctor explained that chloroform was typically administered by saturating a cloth or sponge with the liquid and holding it over the patient's nose and mouth. The vapour was inhaled and carried by the blood to the brain, where it suppressed consciousness within 1 to 3 minutes, depending on concentration and individual susceptibility. The patient could be kept unconscious for as long as necessary by continuing to administer the vapour, and would wake naturally once the administration ceased and the substance cleared from the bloodstream. Blackwell asked about the dangers. Latherby's expression became grave. Chloroform was not without risks, he said. too much could suppress not only consciousness, but also breathing and heart function, leading to death. This had occurred in surgical settings, despite careful monitoring by experienced physicians. The substance had a narrow margin between effective anesthesia and fatal overdose. Moreover, individuals varied in their response to chloroform. Some required very little to lose consciousness. Others were more resistant. A person attempting to use chloroform as a criminal tool would need significant knowledge and skill to judge the correct dosage, especially when dealing with multiple victims simultaneously. This led to Blackwell's central question: could chloroform be effectively administered to passengers inside a moving or stopped coach, and to the coachman above, without the perpetrator being in direct physical contact with the victims? Dr. Lethaby considered this carefully. In theory, he said, it would be possible if the chloroform vapour could be introduced into the enclosed space of the coach in sufficient concentration. The substance vaporized readily at normal temperatures, so heating it would not be necessary. What would be required was a method of releasing the vapour in a controlled manner, perhaps through some kind of tube or nozzle that could be inserted through a window or gap in the coach door. The doctor led Blackwell to another bench where various pieces of glassware were arranged. He assembled a simple apparatus to demonstrate the principle. A flask containing chloroform was connected by the rubber tubing to a glass tube that narrowed to a fine opening. When the flask was tilted, the liquid flowed through the tube and dripped from the opening, immediately beginning to vaporize. If such a device were inserted into a coach, with the liquid dripping onto a warm surface to accelerate vaporization, it could potentially fill the enclosed space with enough vapor to render the occupants unconscious within minutes. The process would be more reliable in cold weather, when people kept coach windows closed, and during fog, when visibility would prevent anyone from noticing the tube being inserted. Blackwell asked whether the horses could also be affected. Lethaby said yes, certainly, though their greater size would require either higher concentration or longer exposure. If the thief approached the horses first and administered chloroform directly to them, perhaps using a saturated cloth held briefly to their nostrils, he could render them docile enough that they would stand still when the coach was stopped. Horses were actually quite susceptible to chloroform, a fact well known to veterinary surgeons who sometimes used it for procedures requiring immobilization. The detective inquired about the sound witnesses had reported, the soft hissing that several had heard just before losing consciousness. Dr. Lethaby suggested this could be the sound of liquid chloroform being released under slight pressure, perhaps from a bulb or syringe device that forced it through a narrow opening. The vaporization itself might also produce a subtle sound as the liquid transitioned to gas. In any case, the hissing would be brief and easily attributed to wind or other environmental sounds by victims already becoming confused by the vapor's effects. Blackwell raised the question of procurement. How difficult would it be for someone to obtain quantities of chloroform sufficient for repeated use? Dr. Lethaby shook his head. Not difficult at all, unfortunately. Chloroform was sold by chemists throughout London for legitimate medical purposes. A person could purchase it by claiming to need it for minor surgical procedures, for treating ailments in animals, even for cleaning or chemical experiments. No special licensing was required. No record was kept of purchases. The only constraint was cost, but chloroform was not particularly expensive compared to other medicines. A person with modest means could easily acquire all they needed. This troubled Blackwell, as it meant the thief could have obtained his supplies from any of hundreds of chemist shops in London, making it nearly impossible to trace the purchases. He asked whether there might be any distinguishing characteristics in chloroform from different sources, any impurities or variations that could identify where a particular sample had been manufactured. Lethaby admitted this was theoretically possible but practically difficult. Chloroform was manufactured by several firms to generally similar standards. Chemical analysis might reveal minor differences, but without samples from both the crimes and potential sources for comparison, such analysis would be useless. The doctor then raised a point that Blackwell had not considered. Using chloroform in the manner described required not only chemical knowledge, but also significant practice. Judging the correct amount to render victims unconscious without killing them doing so in uncontrolled outdoor conditions with wind and cold affecting vaporization rates, working quickly enough to affect multiple victims before any could escape or raise alarm. All of this demanded expertise that could only come from experience. The thief had either received formal medical training or had conducted extensive experimentation to develop his technique. Either possibility suggested someone with education and access to resources beyond what one would expect from a common criminal. Blackwell asked whether a person with such knowledge might be identifiable through professional registries. Were there medical students or qualified physicians who had left their positions under suspicious circumstances? Had any hospital staff been dismissed for inappropriate behaviour involving drugs or anaesthetics? Lethaby said such inquiries would need to go through the Royal College of Physicians and the various hospital administrations, but he would make discreet contacts on Blackwell's behalf. If someone with medical training had become the Silent Highwayman, there might be records of their education and employment that could narrow the field of suspects considerably. The conversation turned to antidotes and protective measures. Could victims be protected against chloroform? Could they be given something beforehand that would prevent the substance from taking effect? Dr. Lethaby was sceptical. No reliable antidote existed for chloroform anesthesia. Once the vapour was inhaled, it would produce its effects inevitably. The only protection would be to avoid inhaling it in the first place, which would require wearing some kind of mask or breathing apparatus. In practical terms, this meant passengers would need to travel with gas masks like those used by chemists when working with dangerous vapours, an impractical solution for ordinary coaching journeys. Blackwell inquired whether a person could build tolerance to chloroform through repeated exposure. The doctor said no, that was not how anaesthetics worked. Unlike some substances where the body adapted to their presence, chloroform produced the same effects regardless of whether the person had been exposed before. This ruled out the possibility that the thief was himself regularly exposed and had somehow become immune, a theory Blackwell had considered and now discarded. As their discussion concluded, Dr. Lethaby assembled a small kit of materials for Blackwell to take with him. Several sealed vials of chloroform for the detective's reference, so he would know the smell and appearance of the pure substance. Some litmus papers that could test for the presence of chloroform in enclosed spaces, though the doctor warned these would only be useful immediately after exposure as the vapour dissipated rapidly. And a brief written summary of chloroform's properties and effects, something Blackwell could share with other investigators or refer to when questioning suspects. Blackwell thanked the doctor for his time and expertise. As he prepared to leave, Lethaby made one final observation. The person using chloroform in this manner was taking considerable risks, not primarily of being caught, but of making a fatal mistake. At some point, he would misjudge the dosage or encounter a victim with the unusual sensitivity to the substance, and someone would die. When that happened, the crime would transform from robbery to murder, bringing far more severe consequences and far more aggressive investigation. The Silent Highwayman was operating on a knife's edge between effective crime and catastrophic failure. It was only a matter of time before he crossed that line. Leaving the hospital, Blackwell walked through the streets shrouded in November fog, turning over in his mind what he had learned. The chloroform theory was no longer speculation, but established fact, confirmed by expert analysis. The thief possessed medical knowledge, access to equipment and expertise in chemical administration. He was educated, methodical, and willing to take risks that would terrify most criminals. This profile was becoming increasingly specific, pointing toward a particular type of individual rather than a generic criminal. Blackwell needed to find men who fit this description and had some connection to the northern roads where the robberies occurred. The field of possible suspects was narrowing slowly but perceptibly, like fog lifting to reveal shapes that had been hidden. Back at Scotland Yard, he added to Lethaby's insights to his growing file on the case. He sent messages to the Royal College of Physicians and to administrators at several London hospitals, requesting information about medical students and physicians who had left their positions in the past 2 years under any kind of cloud or controversy. He also contacted chemists in Hampstead and surrounding areas, asking if they had sold unusual quantities of chloroform recently, or if any purchases stood out as suspicious. These inquiries would take time to produce results, but Blackwell was patient. He was building a net of information that would eventually close around the Silent Highwayman. The thief had been clever and careful, but he had also left traces, small clues embedded in his method and his choice of tools. And Edmund Blackwell specialised in following such traces to their source, no matter how much time and effort the pursuit required. Chapter 8. The Trap on Highgate Road. The plan was formulated in Chief Superintendent Main's office on the morning of November 18th. With Detective Inspector Blackwell presenting his proposal to a gathering of senior officers, who listened with expressions ranging from scepticism to cautious optimism. The fog had returned to London with renewed intensity over the past week, and 2 more robberies had occurred, bringing the total to 27 incidents. The pressure from Parliament and the newspapers had become severe enough that Maine was willing to consider unconventional approaches. Blackwell's proposal was certainly unconventional, but it had the merit of being based on careful analysis rather than desperation. The detective stood before a large map of the northern districts that had been pinned to the wall, marked with coloured pins indicating each robbery location. He traced patterns with his finger as he spoke, showing how the incidents clustered around certain stretches of road, how they occurred only under specific weather conditions, how they followed temporal rhythms that suggested the thief operated on a schedule determined by opportunity and caution. Based on this analysis, Blackwell had identified 3 locations where the next robbery was most likely to occur, assuming it happened within the next week. Of these, the stretch of Highgate Road between the village and the heath seemed most probable, as it had not been hit recently, and offered the isolation and cover the thief required. Blackwell's plan was to stage an elaborate trap. A coach would travel the Highgate Road on evenings when the fog was thick, carrying what appeared to be wealthy passengers and valuable cargo. In reality, the passengers would be police constables in civilian clothing, armed and prepared to resist. Additional constables would be positioned along the road at intervals, hidden but ready to respond at the sound of a whistle. The coach itself would be modified with small viewing holes that would allow the disguised constables inside to observe without being obvious. And Blackwell himself would be riding as coachman, giving him direct control of the situation and ensuring someone experienced in investigation was present to note details that might be crucial later. Superintendent Henderson objected that the thief seemed to know which coaches carried genuine valuables and might avoid an obvious trap. Blackwell countered that they would use an actual private coach owned by a merchant known to travel that road, borrowed for the evening with the owner's cooperation. They would spread word through the coaching offices that a wealthy banker was travelling to his country house with a strong box of securities. The information would be leaked in a way that seemed inadvertent rather than deliberate, so that anyone paying attention to such matters would hear of it without suspecting it was bait. Chief Superintendent Main asked about the risk to the constables inside the coach. If chloroform was used as Blackwell believed, how could the men avoid being rendered unconscious like previous victims? Blackwell explained that Dr. Lethaby had provided dampened cloths treated with a solution that would partially filter chloroform vapour if held firmly over nose and mouths. The protection was not perfect, but would give the constables valuable seconds to act before the drug took full effect. They would be instructed to hold their breath at the first sign of the sweet smell victims had described, apply the treated cloths, and blow their police whistles to summon the hidden reinforcements. The plan was approved with modifications. Instead of 3 locations, they would set traps at all 3 simultaneously, tripling their chances of success. This would require more men, but mainly authorised the deployment, drawing constables from across the metropolitan police districts. Each trap would operate identically, with disguised officers inside coaches, coachmen prepared for trouble, and hidden reinforcements positioned nearby. The operations would run for 5 consecutive nights starting November 20th, covering the period when fog was forecasted to be heaviest. If the Silent Highwayman struck at any of these locations, they would be ready. The preparations consumed 3 days. Coaches were borrowed and modified. Constables were selected for their reliability and given careful instruction about their roles. The hidden positions along the roads were scouted and prepared, with men shown where to conceal themselves and told to remain absolutely still and silent regardless of how long they waited. Word was carefully spread through coaching offices and inns about wealthy passengers planning to travel the northern roads. And Blackwell himself practiced driving the coach that would travel Highgate Road, familiarising himself with its handling and learning the road's every turn and gradient. On the evening of November 20th, the 3 trap operations commenced. The fog was thick as predicted, rolling across London in dense banks that reduced visibility to arm's length in many places. Blackwell, dressed in a coachman's heavy coat and hat, drove his borrowed coach north from Highgate Village just after dark. Inside rode 4 constables disguised as a banker, his clerk, and 2 companions. They carried a strong-box that actually contained nothing but weights to give it appropriate heft. Each man had a police whistle, a treated cloth for protection against chloroform, and a truncheon concealed beneath his coat. Along the road ahead, spaced at intervals of roughly 200 yards, another 20 constables crouched in hiding places among trees and behind hedges, waiting for a signal they hoped would come. The journey proceeded slowly through the fog. Blackwell kept the horses to a careful walk, both for safety and to present a tempting target moving at vulnerable speed. The coach lanterns created small pools of yellow light that illuminated nothing but swirling mist. The sound of wheels and hooves seemed muffled and strange, as though the fog absorbed sound as thoroughly as it blocked vision. Inside the coach, the 4 constables sat in tense silence, listening for any indication that they were being observed or followed. They travelled the designated route for 2 hours, covering the most dangerous stretches repeatedly, but nothing happened. The fog remained impenetrable. The road stayed empty. At 10 o'clock, Blackwell guided the coach to a predetermined inn where the horses were rested, and the constables allowed to stretch cramped limbs and share a quick meal. Then they resumed patrol, continuing until midnight when the operation was called off for the night. The other 2 trap operations reported similar results. No contact with the thief, no incidents, nothing but cold fog and wasted effort. The second night followed the same pattern, and the third. By November 22nd, the men were tired and discouraged. Some questioned whether the thief had somehow learned about the traps and was deliberately avoiding them. Others suggested he had ceased operations entirely, frightened off by the increased police presence. Blackwell remained patient, reminding everyone that investigation required persistence. The thief would strike when conditions and opportunity aligned. They simply needed to be ready when he did. On the 4th night, November 23rd, the fog was the worst it had been all week. It came down like a physical presence, cold and damp and so thick that Blackwell could barely see the horses in front of his coach. Visibility was reduced to mere feet. Sound became distorted and directionless. It was exactly the kind of night when the Silent Highwayman had struck before, and Blackwell felt a prickle of anticipation as he guided the coach out of Highgate Village for the 4th time. They were on the loneliest stretch of the road, equidistant between the village and the heath, when Blackwell noticed the horses beginning to slow. He had not pulled on the reins. The animals were simply reducing their pace of their own accord, their heads drooping, their gait becoming uncertain. He remembered the coachman Albert Simmons describing this same phenomenon. Horses acting as though drugged. Blackwell's hands tightened on the reins and he drew a deep breath, preparing to shout a warning to the men inside. But before he could make a sound, he felt a strange heaviness settling over him, a weight pressing down on his chest and making breathing difficult. He fumbled for the treated cloth Dr. Elusive had provided, pulling it from his coat pocket and pressing it over his nose and mouth. The heaviness did not lift, but seemed to stop increasing. Through the fog he glimpsed movement, a dark shape approaching the coach from the left side where passengers sat. The figure was tall and moved with the unusual grace that victims had described, seeming to glide rather than walk. Blackwell tried to reach for his police whistle but found his arm responding sluggishly, as though moving through water. He managed to get the whistle to his lips and blew, producing a shrill blast that cut through the fog. Inside the coach, the 4 constables had also detected the sweet smell and applied their protective cloths. They heard Blackwell's whistle and immediately began blowing their own, creating a cacophony of shrill notes that should have brought the hidden reinforcements running. But the chloroform, even partially filtered, was affecting them. Constable William Davies, positioned by the left window, saw the dark figure outside. He tried to open the coach door to confront the thief, but found his hands fumbling at the latch, unable to coordinate the simple motion. The figure seemed to notice the whistles and the movement inside the coach. It paused, and for a moment Davies saw a pale face looking in at him through the window, eyes that seemed to assess and calculate in the space of a heartbeat. Then the figure turned and moved away with startling speed, disappearing into the fog as though it had never been there at all. Davies managed to get the door open and stumbled out of the coach, his treated cloth still pressed to his face, but by the time his feet touched the ground, the thief had vanished completely. The other constables emerged from the coach, some of them falling to their knees from dizziness, all of them disoriented and struggling to maintain consciousness. Blackwell climbed down from his box, gripping the coach side for support, and stood swaying in the fog while trying to determine which direction the thief had fled. The hidden constables began arriving, responding to the whistle, but they had been positioned too far apart and the fog had distorted sound until they could not be certain which direction the signals came from. Some had run the wrong way initially, others had struggled through the fog toward where they thought the coach should be, and missed it entirely in the darkness. By the time a dozen men had assembled at the coach, precious minutes had been lost. They organised themselves into pairs and spread out to search, but they were searching blind in fog so thick they could not see their own feet. Blackwell, his head clearing slowly as the chloroform dissipated, examined the area around the coach. He found evidence that confirmed his theories. On the ground beside the left passenger door lay a metal tube about 18 inches long and the diameter of a finger, with a rubber bulb attached to one end. It was still damp inside with chloroform. The thief had apparently dropped it in his haste to flee, the first piece of physical evidence he had left at any robbery scene. Blackwell wrapped it carefully in a cloth and secured it in his coat. Near the front of the coach, he found where someone had stood to administer chloroform to the horses. The ground was disturbed and there was a faint sweet smell lingering in the air. The search continued through the night but produced no results. The thief had fled into the fog and simply disappeared, moving with a speed and sureness that suggested intimate knowledge of the terrain. He might have run in any direction. He might have concealed himself in some hiding place and waited for the searchers to pass. He might have had a horse waiting nearby, though no sound of hooves had been heard. Whatever his method of escape, it had been completely effective. By dawn, when the fog finally began to thin, the police were forced to admit that despite their elaborate trap and quick response, the Silent Highwayman had evaded capture. Yet the operation was not a complete failure. Blackwell had the dispersal device which could be examined for clues about its construction and perhaps its maker. Multiple constables had seen the thief clearly enough to provide consistent descriptions that went beyond the vague impressions of drugged civilians. The figure had been tall, perhaps 6 feet 2 inches, wearing a long dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He had moved with exceptional speed and coordination, and he had demonstrated presence of mind under pressure. Immediately recognizing the trap and fleeing rather than attempting to continue the robbery or fight. Most significantly, the thief now knew the police were actively hunting him with sophisticated methods. He had escaped this time, but he must realize how narrowly. The protected constables had remained conscious long enough to see him and summon help. His dispersal device had been recovered. His previously perfect record of leaving no evidence was broken. These developments would affect his future actions. He might become more cautious, spacing his robberies farther apart and being more selective about targets. Or he might become reckless, taking greater risks to prove he could not be caught. Either response would create opportunities for investigation. Back at Scotland Yard, Blackwell filed his report and delivered the dispersal device to Dr. Letherby for examination. The doctor confirmed it was a simple but effective tool, a metal tube connected to a rubber bulb that could be squeezed to force chloroform through a nozzle in a fine spray. The device was handmade, probably by someone with access to laboratory equipment or a workshop with metalworking tools. The rubber bulb was of a type used in medical apparatus, available from suppliers of surgical equipment. The metal tube showed file marks indicating it had been custom fabricated rather than purchased as a complete unit. This information helped narrow the field of suspects further. The Silent Highwayman had medical knowledge, access to chemical supplies, skill in fabricating apparatus, and detailed knowledge of the northern roads. He was physically tall and moved with unusual grace and speed. He was intelligent enough to recognize a trap immediately and disciplined enough to flee rather than taking foolish risks. And he was bold enough to continue operating despite knowing the police were specifically hunting him. This profile described a very particular type of individual, someone educated and capable who had chosen crime for reasons that likely went beyond simple need for money. Blackwell updated his files and continued his methodical investigation, following up on responses to his earlier inquiries about medical students and physicians with connections to the Hampstead area. Several names had been provided by hospital administrators, men who had left their positions under various circumstances over the past 2 years. Most could be eliminated quickly through basic investigation, but a few warranted closer examination. One in particular caught Blackwell's attention, a former medical student named Jonathan Caldwell, who had been expelled from the London hospital in 1865 for conducting unauthorized experiments with anesthetics. The man had been described by his former teachers as brilliant but erratic, obsessed with the mechanics of consciousness and the boundary between waking and sleeping. Records showed Caldwell had been living in Hampstead at the time of his expulsion. His family had disowned him following the scandal. His current whereabouts were unknown. Blackwell sent constables to make inquiries in Hampstead, asking about a tall man matching Caldwell's description, someone who kept irregular hours and might have access to medical supplies. It was a tenuous lead, one name among many possibilities, but it fit the profile better than most. And in investigation, Blackwell knew, success often came from pursuing such tenuous leads with persistence until they either led somewhere concrete or could be definitively eliminated. The trap on Highgate Road had not captured the Silent Highwayman, but it had drawn him out of the fog long enough to be seen clearly and to leave evidence behind. For the first time since the robberies began, the police had something tangible to work with beyond victim testimony and theoretical analysis. The thief was no longer purely phantom, no longer completely invisible. He had become, in that brief encounter, slightly more real, and therefore slightly more catchable. And Edmund Blackwell, patient and methodical as always, prepared to tighten the net that was slowly closing around London's most elusive criminal. Chapter 9. The Vanishing Act. Jonathan Caldwell, if indeed he was the Silent Highwayman, proved as difficult to locate as the Phantom had been to capture. The inquiries Blackwell set in motion through the final week of November produced fragments of information, but nothing substantial enough to warrant immediate action. A landlady in Hampstead remembered a tall lodger who had rented rooms from her 2 years earlier, a quiet gentleman who paid his rent promptly and kept strange hours, often going out after dark and returning near dawn. She recalled he had been interested in chemistry, keeping bottles and apparatus in his rooms that produced odd smells and occasional small explosions. But he had departed abruptly in the spring of 1866 after she complained about the disturbances, leaving no forwarding address. A chemist in Highgate recalled selling unusual quantities of chloroform and ether to a man matching Caldwell's description over the past year. But the purchases had been made under different names, and the chemist had thought nothing suspicious about them at the time. Medical substances were sold to anyone who could pay, and offered a plausible reason for needing them. The man had claimed to be conducting veterinary work, treating horses and farm animals in the northern suburbs, which explained both the quantities purchased and his interest in anaesthetics. A coachman who operated from a stable yard near Hampstead Heath mentioned that he sometimes saw a tall figure walking the roads late at night, moving with long strides through darkness and fog as though familiar with every turn and hollow. The coachman had assumed it was someone local taking evening exercise, but thinking back on it now, the figure had always been alone, and had never responded to greetings called out to him, simply continuing on his way as though deaf or deliberately ignoring human contact. These reports, along with others similarly vague and circumstantial, suggested that someone matching Caldwell's description and the Silent Highwayman's profile had been present in the area during the period of the robberies. But presence was not proof. Blackwell needed something more concrete, some definitive evidence linking Caldwell to the crimes, or at minimum establishing his current whereabouts so he could be questioned and investigated properly. The former medical student seemed to have vanished as thoroughly as the thief disappeared after his robberies, leaving only traces and rumours behind. The records from the London hospital provided some useful background. Jonathan Caldwell had been born in 1842 to a merchant family in Bristol, the youngest of 3 sons. He had shown exceptional academic ability from childhood, particularly in sciences and mathematics. His family had sent him to London at age 19 to study medicine, expecting him to become a physician and perhaps return to Bristol to establish a respectable practice. For the first 2 years of his medical training, he had performed brilliantly, receiving high marks and the commendation of his instructors. But during his 3rd year, his behaviour had become erratic. He developed an obsessive interest in anaesthesia and the nature of consciousness, conducting experiments that went well beyond what his coursework required. He was discovered one night in the hospital's laboratory, having administered chloroform to himself while alone, attempting to observe and record his own descent into unconsciousness. When questioned by hospital authorities, he explained that he was trying to understand the precise moment when awareness ceased, the boundary between waking and sleep that he believed held profound philosophical importance. He was warned that such experiments were dangerous and forbidden, but he apparently continued them in secret. The final incident that led to his expulsion involved another student whom Caldwell had convinced to participate in what he called a mutual investigation of altered states. The other student had nearly died from chloroform overdose. Caldwell had managed to revive him, but only barely, and the young man had suffered effects that lasted for days afterward, including persistent headaches and disturbing dreams. The hospital authorities had no choice but to expel Caldwell for conduct endangering another student. His family, humiliated by the scandal, had severed ties with him. After that, the records went silent. He had simply disappeared from the registers of respectable society. Blackwell found this history deeply troubling. Here was a man with precisely the knowledge and skills required to be the Silent Highwayman, someone who understood anaesthetics intimately and had demonstrated both brilliance and reckless disregard for normal constraints. His experiments suggested a mind that treated human consciousness as something to be manipulated and studied, exactly the kind of detached perspective that would enable him to drug strangers and rob them without apparent guilt or hesitation. The philosophical interest in the boundary between waking and sleeping aligned eerily with what the thief was doing, repeatedly rendering people unconscious and bringing them back, as though conducting some vast ongoing experiment with the roads of London as his laboratory. Yet without knowing Caldwell's current location, Blackwell could not move forward. He expanded his inquiries, sending letters to police stations throughout London, asking if anyone matching Caldwell's description had come to official attention for any reason. He contacted the Royal College of Physicians to learn if Caldwell had attempted to resume his medical studies elsewhere. He even placed a carefully worded notice in several newspapers, asking Jonathan Caldwell or anyone knowing his whereabouts to contact Scotland Yard regarding a confidential matter. The notice produced several responses from people claiming to have information, but all proved to be either mistaken identity or attempts to claim a reward that had not actually been offered. While this investigation continued, the Silent Highwayman struck again. On the evening of December 2nd, during fog that had returned after several days of clear weather, a mail coach was robbed on the Finchley Road. The method was identical to all previous incidents. The coachman and 2 passengers were found unconscious, drugged with chloroform, their valuables taken. This time, however, there was a disturbing new development. One of the passengers, an elderly man named Albert Thornton, who suffered from a weak heart, nearly died from the effects of the anaesthetic. He had stopped breathing and was revived only through vigorous efforts by the coachman once he regained consciousness. A physician summoned to examine Thornton declared that he had come within minutes of death and might still suffer lasting effects from the experience. This incident transformed the investigation's urgency. Dr. Lethaby's prediction had nearly come true. The thief had misjudged his dosage or encountered a victim with unusual vulnerability, and the result had almost been fatal. The crime was no longer merely robbery, but something approaching murder. The newspapers seized on this development, publishing lurid articles about the phantom killer of Hampstead Heath and demanding that the Metropolitan Police take more aggressive action. Chief Superintendent Mayne summoned Blackwell and asked pointedly whether progress was being made toward identifying and apprehending the perpetrator. Blackwell explained his investigation of Jonathan Caldwell and the difficulties in locating the man. Mayne listened impatiently and then made a decision that would prove consequential. He authorised a public announcement offering a substantial reward, £50, for information leading to the arrest of the Silent Highwayman. Additionally, he had handbills printed with a description of the suspect based on the constable's observations during the trap operation and witness accounts. These handbills were distributed throughout the northern districts, posted on walls and handed out at coaching offices and inns. The description emphasised the suspect's height, his long dark coat, his apparent medical knowledge, and his familiarity with the Hampstead area. The public announcement and handbills produced an immediate response, though not the one the police hoped for. Dozens of people came forward claiming to have seen the Silent Highwayman or to know his identity. Most of these reports were useless, the products of overactive imagination or attempts to collect the reward through fabricated stories. But buried among the false leads were a few that seemed credible. A tavern keeper in Highgate reported that a tall man matching the description had been a regular customer several months earlier, always drinking alone and never engaging in conversation. The man had stopped coming in around October, after the robberies became widely publicised. More significantly, a woman named Sarah Mitchell came to Scotland Yard and told a story that caught Blackwell's attention. She had been employed as a housekeeper by a gentleman living in a cottage on the edge of Hampstead Heath during the summer and the early autumn of 1867. The gentleman had been tall and reserved, giving his name as Mr. John Carson. He kept odd hours and maintained a locked room that Mrs. Mitchell was forbidden to enter. She had glimpsed inside once when he left the door ajar and had seen what appeared to be chemical apparatus, bottles and tubes and burners, arranged on a cook's table. The smell from that room had been sweet and medicinal, exactly like the description she had later read of chloroform in newspaper accounts of the robberies. Mrs. Mitchell said she had paid little attention to these peculiarities at the time, assuming her employer was conducting some kind of scientific study that was none of her concern. But after the robberies became news and the description of the suspect was published, she had begun to wonder if Mr. Carson might be the man the police sought. She had not come forward immediately because she was uncertain and did not want to make false accusations. But after the incident where the elderly man nearly died, her conscience compelled her to share what she knew. Blackwell questioned her closely about Carson's appearance and behaviour. She described him as being in his middle 20s, perhaps 6 feet tall or slightly more, with dark hair and a thin face. He spoke in an educated manner and seemed to be a gentleman despite his isolated living situation. He went out most evenings after dark and returned in the early morning hours. He received no visitors and no mail. He paid her wages in cash and seemed to have adequate funds, though he lived simply. And most tellingly, Mrs. Mitchell said there had been evenings when Carson returned and she caught a whiff of that same sweet medicinal smell clinging to his clothing as though he had been working with the chemicals from his locked room while outdoors. This was the strongest lead Blackwell had received. He asked where the cottage was located, and Mrs. Mitchell provided directions, explaining that she had been dismissed from Carson's employment in late October after she asked too many questions about his nighttime activities. He had paid her what he owed and told her he no longer required household help. She had not been back to the cottage since then and did not know if he still resided there. Blackwell assembled a small group of constables and departed immediately for Hampstead Heath. They reached the cottage as afternoon was fading into evening. It stood isolated at the end of a narrow lane, surrounded by bare trees and overgrown gardens. The windows were dark. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the cold December weather. Blackwell approached cautiously and knocked on the door. There was no answer. He knocked again, announcing himself as Metropolitan Police and requesting entrance. Silence. After waiting a reasonable time, Blackwell made the decision to force entry. The door yielded to a constable's shoulder, and they moved inside, spreading through the small dwelling with lamps held high. The cottage was empty and appeared to have been abandoned for at least a week. Furniture remained, but personal effects were gone. In what must have been the locked room Mrs. Mitchell described, they found evidence that confirmed her story. A table held chemical apparatus, though most of it had been removed. Brown stains on the wood might have been from spilled chloroform. Empty bottles were stacked in a corner, and most significantly, Blackwell found scraps of metal tubing and a discarded rubber bulb. Components identical to those in the dispersal device recovered during the trap operation. But Jonathan Caldwell, or John Carson, or whatever name the Silent Highwayman used, was gone. The cottage offered no clue to where he might have fled. A search of the premises turned up no documents, no letters, nothing with writing that might indicate his destination. He had cleaned out the location systematically, removing anything that might identify him or provide leads for investigators. Only the chemical apparatus remained, too bulky or too unimportant to be worth carrying away. The neighbours, such as they were in this isolated area, knew nothing useful. A farmer whose land adjoined the cottage property said he had seen a tall man living there but had never spoken to him. A woman who walked her dog along the lane said the cottage had been dark for the past week and she had assumed the resident had moved away. No one had seen Carson leave or observed him loading belongings into a cart or carriage. He had simply departed at some point between late November and early December, vanishing as completely as he had after each of his robberies. Blackwell returned to Scotland Yard with frustration weighing heavily on him. They had confirmed that someone matching the Silent Highwayman's description and possessing the necessary equipment had been living within easy reach of the robbery locations. They had established a likely identity, either Jonathan Caldwell or an alias used by him, but the man himself had eluded them once again, fleeing just ahead of the investigation's reach. He must have realised after the trap operation that the police were getting closer. Perhaps he had seen the handbills with their description. Perhaps he had simply sensed that his run of success was ending, and prudently decided to withdraw while he still could. The question now was whether he had left London entirely, or merely gone to ground somewhere else in the vast city. A man with his skills and intelligence could easily establish a new identity and disappear into the anonymous masses. He might continue his criminal career in a different part of London, under a different method. He might flee to another city or even abroad. Or he might simply retire, living on the proceeds of his robberies, having accumulated enough through 28 successful incidents to support himself comfortably for years. Blackwell prepared a detailed report for Chief Superintendent Main, documenting everything they had learned and recommending that Jonathan Caldwell be officially identified as the prime suspect in the Silent Highwayman robberies. A warrant was issued for Caldwell's arrest on charges of robbery and attempted murder. His description was circulated to police forces throughout Britain and to ports where he might attempt to leave the country. Notices were placed in newspapers asking anyone with information about his whereabouts to come forward. But weeks passed without any credible sightings. Jonathan Caldwell, if that was truly his name, had performed his greatest vanishing act, disappearing not from a fog-bound road but from the entire visible world. December progressed and no new robberies occurred. The northern roads gradually returned to normal as fog gave way to clear cold weather and the memory of fear began to fade. Travellers resumed their usual patterns. Coaching companies stopped losing business. The newspapers moved on to other scandals and sensations. The Silent Highwayman became a story people told, legend geared of that strange autumn when a phantom had haunted the roads around London, robbing with impunity and disappearing like smoke. Some claimed he had been a ghost all along, never truly human. Others insisted he had been a master criminal who had planned everything perfectly and retired at the height of his success. A few believed he would return when conditions were right, that he was merely waiting for the next foggy season to resume his work. Blackwell continued to investigate, following up every rumour and possibility. But as winter deepened into 1868, he was forced to acknowledge that the case might never be definitively solved. The Silent Highwayman had won, in the sense that he had committed numerous crimes and escaped justice. But he had also lost, in that he had been driven from his territory and forced to abandon whatever life he had built in Hampstead. The cottage stood empty through the winter, eventually being relet to new tenants who knew nothing of its previous occupant. The chemical apparatus was catalogued as evidence and stored in Scotland Yard's property rooms, and Edmund Blackwell added the file to his collection of unresolved cases where he knew or strongly suspected the identity of the perpetrator, but could not bring them to trial for lack of definitive proof or inability to locate them. The trap had failed to catch the Silent Highwayman, but it had accomplished something almost as valuable. It had identified him, or at least narrowed his identity to a single highly probable individual. It had driven him away from his crimes and ended the reign of fear on the northern roads. And it had demonstrated that even the most clever criminal could be pursued by patient, methodical investigation until he was forced to flee rather than face capture. In that sense, though unsatisfying, it was a kind of success. The Phantom had been revealed as merely a man, brilliant and disturbed, but ultimately bound by human limitations. And somewhere in London or beyond, Jonathan Caldwell lived with the knowledge that his identity was known, his methods understood, and his freedom dependent on never again attempting the crimes that had made him briefly famous as the Silent Highwayman of Victorian London. Chapter 10. The Mystery Unsolved. Winter settled fully over London as the 1860 Avon drew toward its close, bringing cold that froze the Thames in places and turned the city's perpetual fog into frost that coated buildings and streets in white. The northern roads became treacherous with ice, and coaching traffic diminished naturally as people chose to remain indoors rather than risk travel in such conditions. The memory of the Silent Highwaymen began to fade from immediate concern, replaced by more pressing matters of survival through the coldest months. Coal fires burned in every hearth that could afford them. The poor huddled in their tenements and tried to stay warm, and Detective Inspector Edmund Blackwell sat in his office at Scotland Yard, reviewing the case file one final time before consigning it to the archives of unsolved crimes. The file had grown thick over the months of investigation, containing hundreds of pages of testimony, analysis, correspondence, and reports. Blackwell had assembled a comprehensive picture of the crimes and the criminal, understanding the method and the mind behind it as thoroughly as was possible without having the man himself in custody. He knew how the robberies had been committed. He knew why they had been so successful. He knew who had almost certainly committed them. But knowing was not the same as proving in a court of law, and without Jonathan Caldwell in custody to face charges, all the accumulated knowledge was merely academic. The final tally stood at 28 confirmed robberies spanning 3 months from September through early December. Approximately 60 victims had been drugged and robbed. The total value of stolen property exceeded £4,000, a considerable sum that represented dozens of successful crimes. Yet throughout this extended criminal career, only one piece of physical evidence had been recovered. The dispersal device dropped during the trap operation. Everything else, the chloroform, the method of selecting targets, the knowledge of the roads, the ability to vanish afterward, remained matters of inference and reconstruction rather than tangible proof. The psychological effect on victims had been as significant as the material losses. Blackwell had continued to receive letters from people who had been robbed, describing ongoing anxieties and disturbed sleep, feelings of violation that went beyond the simple theft of property. Several had moved away from the northern suburbs entirely, unable to feel safe in areas where they had been attacked. Others refused to travel by coach after dark, their confidence in the security of ordinary journeys permanently shaken. The Silent Highwayman had not merely stolen valuables. He had stolen something less tangible but equally important, the sense that the world was predictable and controllable, that darkness and fog were merely natural phenomena rather than covers for predatory intelligence. The investigation had consumed Blackwell's attention for 6 weeks, and had involved the efforts of dozens of constables and officers. It had cost the Metropolitan Police considerable resources and had exposed weaknesses in their ability to prevent or solve crimes that involved planning and specialised knowledge. The failure to apprehend the perpetrator had been noted in Parliament and criticised in newspapers. Yet Blackwell did not consider the investigation a complete failure. They had identified the likely culprit. They had ended the robberies by making the northern roads too dangerous for the thief to continue operating. They had demonstrated that methodical detective work could penetrate even carefully planned crimes and reveal the human being behind the phantom. What troubled Blackwell most was not the failure to capture Caldwell, but the questions that remained unanswered about his motivations. Why had he committed these crimes? The stolen property suggested profit as a motive, but Caldwell came from a merchant family with means. He had been on track for a respectable medical career before his expulsion. The robberies required extensive preparation and risk that seemed out of proportion to the financial gain. Some criminals stole because they needed money to survive. Others did so from greed, wanting wealth beyond what honest work provided. But Caldwell seemed to be operating from different impulses entirely. Blackwell suspected, based on what he had learned about Caldwell's experiments and interests, that the money was almost secondary. The man had been obsessed with consciousness and the boundary between waking and sleeping. The robberies provided him with opportunities to render people unconscious repeatedly, to study the effects of chloroform under various conditions, to observe human beings in states of vulnerability and helplessness. Perhaps he saw himself as conducting research, using the roads around London as a laboratory, where he could test his theories and techniques. The theft of valuables might have been merely a practical necessity, a way to fund his experiments and his lifestyle, while pursuing his true interest in the manipulation of consciousness. This interpretation, if correct, made Caldwell more dangerous than a simple thief motivated by greed. A man pursuing knowledge without regard for ethics or law was unpredictable and potentially capable of escalating to more severe crimes. The incident where Albert Thornton nearly died suggested that Caldwell was willing to risk killing people in pursuit of his experiments. If he continued on this path, if he established himself somewhere else and resumed his activities, it was only a matter of time before someone actually died from his chloroform administration. And at that point, he would cross from clever criminal to murderer, a transformation that would bring consequences far beyond what he seemed to have considered. Blackwell had written extensively about these concerns in his final report to Chief Superintendent Mayne. He had recommended that the warrant for Caldwell's arrest remain active indefinitely, and that police forces throughout Britain be periodically reminded to watch for anyone matching his description or engaging in activities similar to the Silent Highwayman's methods. He had also suggested that chemists be asked to report any unusual purchases of chloroform, though he acknowledged this would be difficult to enforce given the substance's legitimate medical uses. The goal was to create a network of awareness that might catch Caldwell if he attempted to resume his criminal career elsewhere. But as December turned to January of 1868, and winter continued without any sign of the Silent Highwayman returning or being spotted elsewhere, Blackwell began to entertain the possibility that Caldwell had genuinely retired from crime. Perhaps the trap operation and the near-fatal incident with Thornton had frightened him into recognizing the dangers of what he was doing. Perhaps he had accumulated enough money to satisfy himself and had decided to stop while still free. Perhaps he had simply grown bored with the robberies and moved on to other interests. Whatever his reasoning, the fact remained that the crimes had ceased and the perpetrator had vanished. The coaching trade gradually recovered through the winter and into the spring of 1868. Traffic on the northern roads returned to normal levels. Travellers learned to relax again during evening journeys. The fog still came, rolling in from the Thames and settling over London with the same oppressive thickness it had always possessed, but now it was merely an inconvenience rather than a harbinger of danger. The gaslights still created their useless halos in the mist. The coaches still moved slowly through limited visibility, but no dark figure materialized from the fog to stop them and render their passengers unconscious. In the taverns and coffee houses, people still told stories about the Silent Highwayman, but the stories had begun to transform into legend. Some claimed he had been a disgraced doctor seeking revenge on society. Others said he had been a master criminal from the continent who had come to London to test his skills against the Metropolitan Police. A few insisted he had never existed at all, that the robberies had been committed by multiple thieves who happened to use similar methods and had been conflated into a single phantom by frightened witnesses and sensational newspapers. The truth, known to Blackwell and a handful of other investigators, was more mundane than any of the legends, but also more disturbing, the story of a brilliant man who had turned his intelligence toward criminal ends and had escaped justice through careful planning and timely flight. The victims tried to rebuild their lives and put the experience behind them. Thomas Ridley continued his textile business, though he never again travelled the northern roads after dark. His wife Catherine recovered slowly from her anxiety, aided by time and the absence of any new incidents. The coachmen who had been drugged mostly remained in their profession, though some changed routes to avoid the areas where they had been attacked. The elderly Albert Thornton survived his close brush with death but remained frail, his weak heart further damaged by the chloroform overdose. He wrote to Scotland Yard asking what progress had been made in apprehending his attacker, and Blackwell wrote back explaining honestly that the suspect had been identified but remained at large. The Metropolitan Police learned from the experience and implemented new procedures. Constables were instructed in how to recognise the symptoms of chloroform exposure. Coachmen were advised to be alert for the sweet smell that preceded attacks. The chemical suppliers were asked to maintain better records of purchases, though this request met with limited cooperation from merchants who valued their customers' privacy. And the detective branch, still a relatively small and experimental part of the police force, gained recognition for the methodical investigative work that had at least identified the Silent Highwayman, even if it had not captured him. Edmund Blackwell moved on to other cases, his methodical mind turning to new puzzles that required solution. But he never entirely forgot Jonathan Caldwell, or the mystery of the Silent Highwayman. He kept the file accessible rather than burying it in the archives, checking periodically to see if any new information had emerged. He maintained contacts with police forces in other cities, asking them to alert him if anyone matching Caldwell's description came to their attention. And he occasionally revisited Hampstead, walking the roads where the robberies had occurred, trying to understand the mind that had selected these locations and planned such audacious crimes. Years passed. The Victorian era continued its confident march toward the 20th century. London grew larger and more complex. The railways expanded, new neighbourhoods sprouted where fields had been. The Metropolitan Police modernised and professionalised. Gaslighting gave way gradually to electric illumination. The northern roads were paved and widened to accommodate increasing traffic. And still no word came of Jonathan Caldwell or the Silent Highwayman. He had disappeared as completely as though he had never existed, leaving behind only the memory of that strange autumn when fear had stalked the fog-bound roads and a phantom thief had proven that, even in the modern age of science and progress, there remained mysteries that reason could illuminate but not fully resolve. The case file remained in Blackwell's office throughout his career, a reminder of the investigation that had consumed him for those intense weeks in late 1867, when he finally retired from the Metropolitan Police in 1885, having served for more than 30 years and solved countless crimes. He took the file with him. He spent his retirement years in a small house in Croydon, and visitors who saw the thick folder on his shelf would sometimes ask about it. Blackwell would tell the story of the Silent Highwayman, describing the crimes and the investigation and the brilliant, disturbed man who had committed them and then vanished. Some listeners asked whether Caldwell might still be alive somewhere, perhaps an old man now living quietly on the proceeds of his crimes. Blackwell would say it was possible, though he doubted it. Men like Jonathan Caldwell rarely settled into peaceful retirement. Their natures drove them toward risk and experimentation. More likely, Blackwell believed, Caldwell had died young, either from his own experiments with chemicals or from some other consequence of his reckless pursuit of knowledge without boundaries. Or perhaps he had fled abroad and been lost to history, one more English eccentric dissolved into the larger world beyond London's reach. Others asked whether the robberies might resume, whether some night the fog would roll in thick and a dark figure would once again stop coaches and drug their passengers. Blackwell would shake his head. The world had changed too much. The northern roads were no longer isolated and vulnerable. Police patrols were regular and comprehensive. Chemical purchases were tracked more carefully. And most significantly, the method had been exposed and understood. The Silent Highwayman's success had depended on the inexplicable nature of his crimes, on the appearance of impossibility that prevented effective response. Once the method was known, the mystery vanished, and with it the phantom's power. The last entry in Blackwell's file, written in his own hand shortly before his death in 1891, summarised his final thoughts on the case. He had pursued dozens of criminals over his career, he wrote, bringing most to justice and seeing them punished according to law. But Jonathan Caldwell had been different, a man whose brilliance and pathology intertwined so completely that it was impossible to separate the genius from the madness. The Silent Highwayman had been a creature of his particular moment, enabled by the fog and darkness of Victorian London, by the gaps in police coverage and scientific understanding, by the very conditions that made his crimes possible. In another time or place, he would have been merely a troubled medical student or an eccentric researcher. But in the autumn of 1867, all the elements had aligned to create something unique and terrible, and in its way, darkly fascinating. Blackwell concluded his notes with a question that had no answer. What had become of Jonathan Caldwell? Had he found peace or continued his desperate experiments? Had he recognised the evil in what he had done or rationalised it as necessary for knowledge? Had he lived a long life or met an early end? The detective would never know. The mystery remained unsolved, not in its particulars, but in its conclusion, a story without proper ending, a phantom who had never fully materialised and never fully vanished. And so the file was closed at last, archived among the records of Victorian crime, a testament to the limits of investigation and the persistent shadows that even the best detectives could not fully illuminate. The Silent Highwayman passed into history and legend, one more dark story from a dark time, remembered by fewer people with each passing year, until finally he existed only in old records and occasional books about Victorian crime, a footnote to an era that had believed in progress and rationality, while still producing mysteries that neither could fully explain. The fog had given him up reluctantly, revealing just enough to show he had been human after all, but not enough to bring him to justice. And in the end, perhaps that was his most perfect vanishing act, to fade not from a roadside but from history itself, leaving behind only questions and the faint sweet smell of chloroform that lingered in memory long after the actual substance had evaporated into London's cold winter air. The candle burned low in Blackwell's study as he finished his final entry. The room fell silent. Outside, the world continued its turning, indifferent to mysteries solved and unsolved, to phantoms caught and uncaught. And history once again turned the page in the dark, moving forward into new centuries while the old mysteries remained behind, suspended forever in the fog of time, neither fully forgotten nor fully remembered, simply waiting in the archives for anyone curious enough to seek them out and wonder what hot truth might lie buried in the testimony of frightened witnesses and the careful notes of a patient detective who had come so close to catching a phantom but in the end had caught only smoke.